The Angles emerged from the windswept coastal plains and marshy lowlands of what would later become known as Schleswig-Holstein and southern Jutland, a region where the North Sea's grey waters met fertile agricultural lands dotted with ancient burial mounds and scattered farmsteads. Archaeological excavations conducted throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries have revealed a complex picture of Anglian settlement patterns spanning nearly 5 centuries, from the 1st through 5th centuries AD. These investigations, particularly those at sites like Needham, Thorsberg, and the numerous cemetery complexes near modern-day Schleswig, have uncovered stratified deposits containing distinctive material remains that allow historians to trace the gradual development of Anglian tribal identity during the Roman Iron Age and Migration period. The earliest archaeological evidence for Anglian presence appears in the form of scattered farmstead complexes dating to the 1st century AD, characterised by rectangular longhouses constructed with timber frames and wattle and daub walls. These structures, typically measuring 15 to 30 metres in length, featured divided interior spaces with areas designated for human habitation at one end and livestock shelter at the other. The discovery of carbonised grain remains, particularly barley and oats, alongside iron agricultural tools such as ploughshares and sickles, indicates that these early Anglian communities practiced mixed farming, combining cereal cultivation with animal husbandry focused primarily on cattle, sheep, and pigs. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the archaeological record reveals significant changes in settlement density and organisation. Excavations at sites like Feddersen-Veerde have uncovered evidence of nucleated villages containing multiple farmsteads arranged around common areas, suggesting increased social organisation and cooperative agricultural practices. The presence of specialised craft workshops, identifiable through concentrations of metalworking debris, bone and antler working tools, and pottery production facilities, indicates growing economic complexity within Anglian communities. Iron slag deposits and fragments of clay furnace linings found at these sites demonstrate local iron production capabilities, while the discovery of bronze brooches and decorative metalwork suggests access to broader trade networks extending across northern Europe. The linguistic foundations of Anglian identity can be traced through careful analysis of Proto-Germanic linguistic developments and the subsequent evolution of West Germanic dialects. The Anglian language emerged as part of the broader Ingvaeonic or North Sea Germanic linguistic group, sharing certain phonological and grammatical features with neighbouring Frisian, Saxon, and Jutish dialects, while maintaining distinct characteristics that would later influence the development of Old English. Comparative linguistic analysis reveals that early Anglian retained certain archaic Proto-Germanic features longer than other West Germanic dialects, particularly in its preservation of certain consonant clusters and vowel distinctions that underwent changes in neighbouring linguistic communities. The Anglian dialect exhibited specific phonological innovations that distinguished it from Saxon and Jutish speech patterns. Most notably, the Anglian treatment of Proto-Germanic AI developed differently from Saxon varieties, with Anglian showing a tendency toward monophthongization in certain phonetic environments. Similarly, the development of Proto-Germanic AU followed distinct patterns in Anglian, contributing to the dialect's unique sound system. Morphological analysis of reconstructed Anglian forms suggests retention of certain case distinctions and verbal inflections that underwent simplification in neighbouring dialects, indicating a conservative linguistic tradition that may reflect social or cultural factors within Anglian communities. Lexical evidence from later Old English texts and place name studies provides additional insights into early Anglian linguistic characteristics. The preservation of specific vocabulary items related to maritime activities, agricultural practices, and social organisation in areas of later Anglian settlement in Britain suggests continuity of linguistic traditions from the continental homeland. terms related to ship construction, navigation, and coastal geography that appear in Old English texts can often be traced to continental Germanic origins, supporting theories about the maritime orientation of Anglian society during the pre-migration period. The material culture of the Angles reveals sophisticated artistic and technological traditions that distinguish them from neighbouring Germanic tribes. Pottery analysis from Anglian sites shows distinctive vessel forms and decorative techniques that remained consistent across multiple centuries and geographical locations. Anglian ceramics typically featured angular shoulder profiles on storage jars and cooking pots, with decorative schemes emphasising geometric patterns created through stamped impressions, incised lines, and applied cordons. The clay composition analysis reveals local production using specific temper materials, particularly crushed granite and quartz, that reflect the geological characteristics of the Schleswig-Holstein region. Metalworking traditions among the Angles demonstrate high levels of technical skill and artistic sophistication. Bronze brooches recovered from Anglian graves display distinctive stylistic elements, including spiral motifs, interlaced patterns, and zoomorphic designs that would later influence Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions in Britain. The technical analysis of these artefacts reveals advanced casting techniques, including the use of complex multi-part moulds and sophisticated alloy compositions that maximised both durability and aesthetic appeal. Iron weapons found in Anglian contexts, particularly spearheads and shield bosses, exhibit characteristic proportions and decorative elements that distinguish them from Saxon or Jutish examples. Burial practices provide crucial insights into Anglian social organisation, religious beliefs and cultural values. The majority of Anglian cemeteries from the 1st through 4th centuries AD feature cremation burials, with the deceased's remains placed in ceramic urns and interred in shallow pits. These urns often contained grave goods, including personal ornaments, weapons, and domestic implements that reflect both the individual's social status and broader cultural practices. The spatial organisation of cemeteries reveals family groupings and social hierarchies, with certain areas containing burials with exceptionally rich grave assemblages suggesting the presence of elite individuals or families. The transition from cremation to inhumation burial during the 4th and 5th centuries AD reflects broader cultural changes within Anglian society, possibly influenced by contact with Roman provincial populations or changing religious practices. Inhumation graves from this period often contain elaborate grave goods arrangements, with weapons placed alongside the deceased and personal ornaments positioned according to specific conventions. Female burials frequently include distinctive brooch pairs, bead necklaces, and domestic implements, while male graves typically contain spears, shields, and occasionally swords. The quality and quantity of metalwork in these later burials suggest increasing social stratification and wealth accumulation within Anglian communities. The geographical extent of Anglian territory encompassed the coastal regions of what is now Schleswig-Holstein and southern Denmark, stretching from the Ida River in the south to approximately the Kongea River in the north. This territory included both the fertile agricultural lands of the interior and the coastal marshlands that provided access to marine resources and maritime trade routes. The western boundary of Anglian lands likely extended to the North Sea coast, while the eastern limits reached the Baltic Sea shores, giving the Angles control over strategic coastal territories that facilitated both local subsistence activities and long-distance trade connections. Archaeological site distributions reveal that Anglian settlements concentrated particularly heavily in the river valleys that provided access to both agricultural land and transportation routes. The Schlei Inlet, a narrow fjord extending deep into the Jutland Peninsula, appears to have been especially significant in Anglian territorial organisation, with numerous high-status sites located along its shores. The strategic importance of this waterway for both local transportation and connections to broader Scandinavian trade networks likely contributed to the development of proto-urban centres that would later play crucial roles in Anglian political and economic organisation. The relationship between Anglian territorial boundaries and those of neighbouring tribes reveals a complex pattern of interaction, competition, and cultural exchange. To the south, Anglian lands bordered Saxon territories, with the boundary zone characterised by mixed cultural assemblages that suggest both conflict and cooperation between these related peoples. Archaeological evidence from border regions includes fortified sites and weapon deposits that may reflect territorial disputes, while the presence of shared artistic styles and technological traditions indicates ongoing cultural communication despite political tensions. The territorial boundaries that defined Anglian lands also shaped the complex social hierarchies that governed daily life within their communities. Archaeological evidence from cemetery excavations reveals a sophisticated stratification system that extended far beyond simple distinctions between rich and poor, encompassing multiple layers of social distinction that reflected both economic capacity and hereditary status. At the apex of Anglian society stood the warrior elites, identifiable through grave assemblages containing elaborate weapon sets, imported luxury goods, and distinctive personal ornaments that marked their elevated position within the tribal hierarchy. The burial of a high-status male at Nidaros provides exceptional insight into the material culture of Anglian warrior elites. The grave contained a complete weapon set including a pattern-welded sword with silver-inlaid hilt fittings, 2 spears with decorated iron heads, a painted wooden shield with bronze boss and rim fittings, and a seax knife with intricate geometric patterns etched into the blade. The sword blade itself measured 85 centimeters in length and displayed the characteristic serpentine patterns created through the complex process of pattern welding, where multiple iron and steel rods were twisted together and folded repeatedly to create both functional strength and visual appeal. Silver wire inlay work decorated the hilt, featuring interlaced animal motifs that required considerable metalworking expertise to execute. Beyond weapons, elite graves contained imported goods that demonstrate extensive trade connections spanning continental Europe. Glass vessels from Rhineland workshops, amber beads from Baltic sources, and bronze vessels of Roman manufacture appear regularly in high-status burials. A particularly remarkable grave from the Schleswig area contained a complete Roman bronze service including a handled pan, strainer and ladle, alongside locally manufactured drinking horns with silver-gilt mounts. The presence of such items indicates not merely wealth accumulation, but active participation in long-distance exchange networks that connected Anglian elites with Roman provincial markets and Scandinavian trading centres. The ceorls, or free farmers, formed the backbone of Anglian society and comprised the largest segment of the population. Their graves typically contained functional items that reflected their agricultural lifestyle: iron knives, whetstones, fire steels, and simple personal ornaments. Male call burials often included a single spear, indicating their obligation to serve in the tribal levy during times of conflict, while female graves contained domestic implements such as spindle whorls, weaving batons, and cooking vessels. The quality of metalwork in coal graves varied considerably, suggesting internal stratification within this social group ranging from prosperous farmers with substantial landholdings to smallholders with minimal surplus resources. Pottery assemblages from sural graves reveal standardized production techniques that indicate specialized craft production within Anglian communities. The vessels display consistent rim forms, surface treatments, and decorative schemes that suggest organized workshops serving local markets. Technical analysis of clay fabrics shows careful selection of raw materials and standardized tempering practices using crushed granite and organic materials. The uniformity of vessel forms across different cemetery sites indicates shared cultural traditions and possibly centralised distribution systems that connected rural communities with specialised production centres. At the bottom of Anglian social hierarchy were the slaves, whose presence in the archaeological record requires careful interpretation due to the limited material evidence for their existence. Slave burials, when identifiable, typically lack grave goods entirely or contain only the most basic personal items. Several cemetery excavations have revealed burials positioned at the periphery of main burial areas, suggesting marginalised status within the community. These graves often show evidence of poor nutrition and physical stress, including skeletal indicators of heavy manual labour and inadequate diet. The positioning of such burials away from family groups implies social exclusion that extended beyond death into the afterlife beliefs of Anglian communities. The religious practices of the continental Angles combined ancient Germanic traditions with evolving beliefs that reflected their changing social and political circumstances. Archaeological evidence from votive deposits and ceremonial sites reveals a complex pantheon of deities associated with warfare, fertility, and natural phenomena. Weapon deposits recovered from bog sites like Thorsberg and Nidam contain hundreds of deliberately destroyed spears, swords, and shields that were offered to the gods following military victories. The systematic destruction of these weapons through bending, breaking, and burning indicates ritual practices designed to transfer the spiritual power of defeated enemies to the tribal deities. Woden occupied a central position in Anglian religious consciousness as the god of war, wisdom, and death. Iconographic evidence from metalwork and carved bone objects depicts a one-eyed figure associated with ravens and wolves, attributes that align with later literary descriptions of this deity. Votive offerings to Woden typically included weapons and horse equipment, suggesting his particular association with mounted warriors and military leadership. Several high-status graves contain horse bits and spurs alongside human burials, indicating beliefs about mounted warfare in the afterlife and the continued need for martial equipment beyond death. Thunur, the thunder god, appears in Anglian religious practices through the widespread use of hammer-shaped amulets and the presence of hammer symbols on metalwork and pottery. Archaeological excavations have recovered numerous small iron and bronze hammers from both settlement sites and graves, many showing evidence of deliberate miniaturization that suggests symbolic rather than functional use. The association between Thunur and protection appears in the placement of hammer amulets in children's graves and their incorporation into women's jewellery sets, indicating beliefs about divine protection for vulnerable community members. Fertility deities played crucial roles in Anglian agricultural communities, with archaeological evidence suggesting elaborate seasonal ceremonies designed to ensure successful harvests and livestock reproduction. Excavations at several settlement sites have revealed structured deposits containing agricultural tools, animal bones, and grain offerings buried in specific locations within farmstead complexes. These deposits typically occur near the boundaries between cultivated fields and wild lands, suggesting beliefs about divine forces that controlled the transition between human-controlled and natural spaces. Ancestor worship formed another significant component of Anglian religious practice, evidenced through the careful maintenance of cemetery sites and the continued deposition of offerings at earlier burial locations. Several cemetery excavations have revealed evidence of post-burial activities, including the placement of food offerings, the lighting of fires over grave sites, and the construction of small wooden structures that may have served as shrines. The positioning of later burials in proximity to earlier high-status graves suggests beliefs about ancestral protection and the continued influence of deceased elites over community welfare. The economic foundations of Anglian society rested primarily on mixed agricultural practices adapted to the environmental conditions of their coastal homeland. Palynological evidence from bog cores and archaeological deposits reveals landscape management practices that create a mosaic of cultivated fields, managed pastures, and preserved woodland areas. The Angles practiced a sophisticated crop rotation system that alternated cereal cultivation with fallow periods used for grazing livestock, maximising both grain production and animal husbandry within limited territorial boundaries. Barley and oats formed the primary cereal crops, with archaeological evidence indicating selective breeding practices that improved yield and resistance to coastal climate conditions. Carbonised grain assemblages from storage pits show consistent grain sizes and morphological characteristics that suggest careful seed selection over multiple generations. The presence of specialised storage facilities, including raised granaries and sealed ceramic vessels, indicates surplus production beyond immediate subsistence needs, supporting both craft specialisation and trade activities. Animal husbandry focused primarily on cattle, sheep and pigs, with evidence for selective breeding practices that emphasise specific characteristics suited to local conditions. Cattle bones from Anglian sites show increased body size over time, indicating deliberate selection for larger animals that could provide both milk production and draft power for agricultural work. Sheep remains display characteristics associated with wool production rather than meat consumption, suggesting specialised breeding for textile raw materials. Pig bones are particularly abundant in settlement contexts, reflecting the suitability of swine for forest management and waste disposal within farming communities. Fishing activities provided crucial protein supplements and trade commodities for coastal Anglian communities. Archaeological evidence from shell middens and fish bone assemblages reveals sophisticated marine resource exploitation, including both inshore fishing and deeper water activities. The presence of specialised fishing equipment, including bone fish hooks, lead net weights, and iron harpoon heads, indicates technological adaptation to marine environments. Seasonal fishing camps along the coast show evidence of intensive processing activities, including fish drying and salt production for preservation purposes. The amber trade represented one of the most significant economic activities connecting Anglian communities with broader European commercial networks. Archaeological excavations along Baltic coastal sites have revealed amber working areas containing raw amber nodules, manufacturing debris and finished ornaments in various stages of completion. The technical sophistication of Anglian amber working included drilling techniques for bead production, carving methods for decorative pendants, and polishing procedures that enhanced the natural beauty of the material. Finished amber products appear in graves throughout northern Europe, indicating extensive distribution networks that carried Anglian craftsmanship far beyond their territorial boundaries. Trade networks extended beyond amber to include iron production, textile manufacturing and pottery distribution. Iron ore deposits in the Anglian homeland supported specialised smelting operations that produced both local tools and export products. Archaeological evidence from production sites includes multiple furnace structures, extensive slag deposits, and specialised tools for metalworking activities. The consistent quality of iron products found across Anglian territory suggests centralised production standards and possibly guild-like organisation among metalworkers. Textile production represented another significant economic activity, with archaeological evidence indicating both domestic and specialised manufacturing. Loom weights, spindle whorls and weaving battens appear consistently in female graves and settlement contexts, while the discovery of large-scale textile production areas suggests organised workshops serving broader markets. The presence of imported dyestuffs and specialised textile tools indicates participation in long-distance trade networks that brought raw materials and technical knowledge from across northern Europe. Tribal governance among the Angles centred on assemblies known as things, where free community members gathered to resolve disputes, make collective decisions, and coordinate military activities. Archaeological evidence for these assemblies comes primarily from the identification of large open spaces within settlement complexes that show evidence of regular gathering activities. These areas typically feature worn surfaces, post holes for temporary structures, and artifact distributions suggesting repeated use for community meetings. The thing assemblies operated according to established procedures that balanced individual rights with collective needs. Archaeological evidence suggests these gatherings occurred at regular intervals, possibly aligned with seasonal agricultural cycles or religious festivals. The presence of specialized seating areas and raised platforms at some assembly sites indicates hierarchical organization within the democratic process, with certain individuals holding elevated status during proceedings. War leaders known as Heretoga played crucial roles in Anglian political organization, serving as military commanders during conflicts and influential voices in thing assemblies during peacetime. The archaeological identification of Heretoga requires careful analysis of burial assemblages and settlement patterns that indicate military leadership roles. High-status male graves containing complete weapon sets, imported luxury goods, and symbols of authority provide the clearest evidence for this social position. The material culture associated with Heretoga includes distinctive weapon combinations that set them apart from ordinary warriors. Pattern-welded swords appear almost exclusively in graves identified as belonging to war leaders, while the presence of multiple spears and specialized shield fittings suggests command responsibilities over larger military units. The inclusion of horse equipment in these burials indicates mounted warfare capabilities that enhanced both military effectiveness and social prestige within Anglian society. The sophisticated political structures and economic networks that had sustained Anglian communities for centuries faced unprecedented challenges during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, as dramatic climatic shifts transformed the environmental conditions of northern Germany and southern Denmark. Paleoclimatic evidence from ice cores, bog deposits, and dendrochronological studies reveals a period of significant cooling that began around 350 AD and intensified throughout the following century. Average temperatures dropped by approximately 1–2 degrees Celsius across northern Europe, while precipitation patterns shifted toward increased winter rainfall and reduced summer growing seasons that severely impacted agricultural productivity in the marginal lands occupied by Germanic tribes. The climatic deterioration manifested most severely in the coastal regions, where Anglian communities had established their agricultural systems. Sea level fluctuations associated with the cooling period caused extensive flooding of low-lying agricultural areas, particularly in the river deltas and coastal plains that had supported dense farming populations. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlement sites shows layers of marine sediment deposited over former agricultural fields, indicating catastrophic inundation events that forced entire communities to relocate to higher ground. The Feddersen-Weerde site provides particularly clear evidence of this process, with excavation layers showing the progressive abandonment of lower-lying farmsteads and the concentration of population in elevated areas that offered protection from rising waters. Pollen analysis from bog cores throughout Schleswig-Holstein demonstrates the broader environmental transformation occurring during this period. Forest clearance activities that had characterized earlier centuries reversed dramatically as abandoned agricultural land reverted to woodland. The proportion of cereal pollen in sediment cores drops precipitously after 400 AD, while tree species associated with secondary forest growth increase correspondingly. This evidence indicates not merely temporary agricultural difficulties, but fundamental changes in land use patterns that reflected population decline and territorial abandonment across large areas of traditional Anglian territory. The environmental pressures created cascading effects throughout Anglian society as traditional subsistence strategies failed to provide adequate resources for growing populations. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities shows decreased grain deposits during the late 4th century, while cattle bone assemblages indicate smaller animal sizes consistent with nutritional stress and reduced pasture quality. The discovery of human skeletal remains showing evidence of malnutrition and increased infant mortality rates provides direct evidence of demographic crisis within Anglian communities during this period. Population pressure intensified as communities concentrated in the remaining viable agricultural areas, creating competition for resources that had previously supported smaller, more dispersed settlements. Cemetery evidence reveals increased frequencies of weapon injuries and violent deaths during the late 4th and early 5th centuries, suggesting escalating conflicts over territorial control and resource access. The appearance of fortified settlements with defensive earthworks and palisades indicates a shift toward more militarized community organization as groups prepared for both defensive and offensive operations in an increasingly competitive landscape. The Anglian response to these environmental and demographic pressures occurred within the broader context of the Volkerwanderung, the massive population movements that reshaped the political and cultural geography of Europe during the 4th through 6th centuries. Germanic tribes throughout northern and central Europe faced similar environmental challenges, creating a domino effect of territorial displacement and migration that extended from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. The Angles found themselves part of a vast network of tribal movements that offered both opportunities for territorial expansion and threats from displaced populations seeking new homelands. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing interaction between Anglian communities and neighbouring Germanic tribes during the migration period. Weapon deposits from bog sites contain spearheads and sword types characteristic of Saxon, Jutish, and Frisian manufacture, alongside traditional Anglian forms, indicating either military cooperation or the incorporation of foreign warriors into Anglian warbands. Cemetery assemblages show similar patterns of cultural mixing, with burial practices and grave goods reflecting influences from multiple Germanic traditions. The appearance of Frankish-style belt fittings and Saxon-type brooches in Anglian graves suggests diplomatic exchanges or intermarriage between tribal elites seeking to establish alliances during the unstable migration period. The relationship between Angles and Saxons proved particularly significant, as both tribes faced similar environmental pressures and territorial constraints in their North Sea coastal homelands. Archaeological evidence suggests initial cooperation between these related peoples, with shared settlement sites and mixed cultural assemblages indicating peaceful coexistence or alliance formation. The Thorsberg bog deposits contain weapons bearing both Anglian and Saxon stylistic characteristics, possibly representing joint military activities or ceremonial exchanges between tribal leaders. However, competition for limited resources eventually created tensions that contributed to the decision of both groups to seek territorial expansion beyond their traditional boundaries. Frisian interactions with Anglian communities reveal a different pattern of relationship characterized by maritime cooperation and trade partnerships. The shared coastal environment and similar subsistence strategies create natural connections between these peoples, evidenced through the distribution of Frisian pottery types in Anglian settlements and the appearance of Anglian metalwork in Frisian archaeological contexts. The technical similarities between Anglian and Frisian ship construction techniques suggest collaborative development of maritime technologies that would prove crucial for later migration activities across the North Sea. Jutish tribes occupying the northern portions of the Jutland Peninsula maintained complex relationships with Anglian communities that alternated between cooperation and competition depending on local circumstances. Archaeological evidence from border regions shows periods of cultural exchange marked by shared artistic styles and technological innovations, alternating with phases of conflict evidenced through weapon deposits and fortified settlement construction. The similarity of Jutish and Anglian burial practices and religious symbols suggests common cultural origins, while differences in territorial organisation and political structures created potential sources of friction between these related peoples. The expansion of Hunnic power under Attila created shockwaves throughout the Germanic world that fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of tribal leaders across northern Europe. The Hunnic Confederation's westward advance during the 440 SAD displaced Gothic, Vandal, and other Germanic populations from their traditional territories in Central and Eastern Europe, creating a massive refugee crisis that placed additional pressure on already strained resources in northern Germanic lands. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites throughout Anglian territory shows increased construction activity during this period, indicating preparations for potential Hunnic attacks or influxes of displaced populations fleeing Hunnic expansion. The psychological impact of Hunnic military success extended far beyond the immediate zones of conquest, creating widespread fear and uncertainty among Germanic tribal leaders. The Huns' reputation for military effectiveness and brutal treatment of conquered populations encouraged preemptive migration among tribes that might otherwise have remained in their traditional territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Germanic communities began preparing for potential evacuation during the 440s and 450 SAD, with increased weapon production, the construction of portable wealth in the form of jewellery and precious metals, and the development of maritime transportation capabilities. Hunnic diplomatic activities also influenced Germanic tribal relationships through a complex system of alliances, tributary arrangements, and hostage exchanges that created new patterns of political alignment across northern Europe. Some Germanic leaders chose to ally with Hunnic forces in exchange for protection and opportunities for territorial expansion, while others formed defensive coalitions aimed at resisting Hunnic expansion. The Angles appear to have avoided direct involvement in these larger political arrangements, but the instability created by Hunnic activities contributed to their decision to seek territorial expansion beyond continental Europe. The domino effect of Hunnic expansion created opportunities as well as threats for Anglian communities. The displacement of other Germanic tribes opened potential territorial niches that could support Anglian expansion, while the general instability of the period made maritime migration to distant lands appear increasingly attractive compared to continued competition for limited resources in traditional homelands. Archaeological evidence suggests that Anglian leaders began developing long-distance maritime capabilities during this period, with improvements in ship construction techniques and navigation equipment that would prove essential for later migration activities. The Roman withdrawal from Britain in 410 AD created unprecedented opportunities for Germanic expansion that coincided perfectly with the environmental and political pressures driving tribal movements across northern Europe. The collapse of Roman administrative structures left a power vacuum in a wealthy, fertile land that had supported Roman civilization for nearly 4 centuries. Archaeological evidence from Romano-British sites shows rapid deterioration of urban centres, abandonment of villa complexes, and breakdown of economic networks that had sustained Roman provincial society. The Romano-British population found itself increasingly unable to maintain effective resistance against external threats without Roman military support. Archaeological evidence from British defensive sites shows hasty construction of earthwork fortifications and the reoccupation of Iron Age hill forts, indicating desperate attempts to organise local defence systems. However, the fragmentation of Romano-British society into competing local kingdoms created opportunities for external intervention that Germanic war leaders were quick to exploit. Early Germanic involvement in British affairs began through mercenary service to Romano-British leaders seeking military assistance against Scottish and Irish raiders. Archaeological evidence from eastern British sites dating to the early 5th century shows the presence of Germanic material culture, including characteristic pottery types, metalwork styles, and burial practices that indicate permanent settlement rather than temporary military occupation. These early settlements appear to have been established through formal agreements with local British authorities who granted land in exchange for military service. The success of these initial Germanic settlements encouraged larger-scale migration as word spread throughout continental Germanic communities about the opportunities available in Britain. The fertile agricultural land, relatively sparse population, and political fragmentation of post-Roman Britain presented ideal conditions for tribal expansion. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic increase in Germanic settlement activity throughout eastern Britain during the mid-5th century, with new communities established along river valleys and coastal plains that offered both agricultural potential and defensive advantages. The maritime capabilities that Anglian communities had developed through centuries of coastal living proved crucial for successful migration to Britain. Archaeological evidence from ship burials and harbour sites reveals sophisticated vessel construction techniques that enabled long-distance sea travel with substantial numbers of people and livestock. The Nidam ship, discovered in a bog deposit and dating to the 4th century AD, provides exceptional insight into Germanic naval technology during the migration period. The vessel measured 23 metres in length and could accommodate a crew of approximately 45 individuals, with construction techniques that emphasise both seaworthiness and speed. The logistical challenges of organising large-scale maritime migration required unprecedented levels of tribal cooperation and planning. Archaeological evidence suggests that Anglian migration to Britain occurred through organised expeditions involving multiple communities rather than random individual movements. The consistency of material culture found in early Anglian settlements in Britain indicates coordinated migration that preserved tribal identity and social structures during the relocation process. Cemetery evidence from both continental and British sites shows continuity in burial practices and grave good assemblages that suggest successful maintenance of cultural traditions despite geographical displacement. The environmental and political pressures that drove Anglian migration were not unique to this particular tribe, but reflected broader transformations affecting all Germanic peoples during the 5th century AD. The convergence of climatic deterioration, population pressure, Hunnic expansion, and Roman withdrawal created a perfect storm of circumstances that made large-scale migration not merely attractive, but necessary for tribal survival. The archaeological record reveals that Anglian communities responded to these challenges through careful planning, technological innovation, and political organisation that enabled successful territorial expansion across the North Sea to the fertile lands of post-Roman Britain. The deteriorating conditions across northern Europe that had prompted widespread Germanic migration found their most dramatic expression in the events that unfolded in post-Roman Britain during the middle decades of the 5th century AD. The convergence of environmental pressures, political instability, and economic opportunity created circumstances that would transform both the Germanic tribes seeking new territories and the Romano-British populations struggling to maintain their civilization without imperial support. Archaeological evidence from sites across eastern England reveals the complex process through which temporary military arrangements evolved into permanent territorial conquest, fundamentally altering the demographic and cultural landscape of Britain. Vortigern, a Romano-British leader whose authority extended across significant portions of what had been the Roman provinces of Britannia Prima and Britannia Secunda, faced mounting pressure from Scottish Picts raiding southward and Irish Scoti attacking western coastal settlements. The archaeological record from British defensive sites dating to the 440 SAD shows hasty construction of earthwork fortifications and the refortification of abandoned Roman signal stations, indicating desperate attempts to organise resistance against these external threats. Excavations at sites like Burdeswold on Hadrian's Wall reveal evidence of continued occupation by Romano-British forces, but with significantly reduced material culture and improvised defensive modifications that suggest declining resources and organisational capacity. The decision to invite Germanic mercenaries represented a calculated response to military necessity rather than a naive miscalculation, as later chroniclers would suggest. Romano-British leaders had extensive knowledge of Germanic military capabilities through centuries of contact across the Channel, and archaeological evidence indicates that small numbers of Germanic warriors had served in Roman forces stationed in Britain during the later imperial period. Germanic belt fittings, weapon types, and pottery sherds found in late Roman military contexts at sites like Richborough and Port Chester demonstrate this earlier presence and suggest established networks of recruitment and communication between British and continental Germanic communities. The initial invitation extended to Hengest and Horsa around 449 AD, according to later Anglo-Saxon chronicle accounts, represented the formalisation of arrangements that had likely been developing through informal channels for several years. Archaeological evidence from Thanet and the broader Thames estuary region shows the establishment of Germanic settlements during the 440 SAD that predate the traditional invasion narrative, suggesting that mercenary recruitment began earlier than literary sources indicate. These early settlements feature characteristic Germanic pottery types, particularly stamped and decorated vessels that match continental Anglian and Saxon production traditions, alongside Romano-British ceramics that indicate interaction with local populations. The material culture from these earliest Germanic settlements reveals careful adaptation to local conditions while maintaining continental traditions. Excavations at Canterbury have uncovered Germanic-style sunken-featured buildings constructed using traditional techniques but incorporating Romano-British building materials, including reused stone, tile and brick. The pottery assemblages from these structures combine continental Germanic forms with local Romano-British types, suggesting both cultural continuity with homeland traditions and practical adaptation to available resources and local preferences. The transition from mercenary service to territorial conquest occurred gradually through a process that archaeological evidence suggests involved both negotiated agreements and violent confrontation. The distribution of early Germanic settlement sites shows initial concentration in areas that had been granted as payment for military service, particularly the fertile river valleys of Kent, Essex and East Anglia, where Roman villa complexes provided ready-made agricultural infrastructure. However, the expansion of Germanic settlement beyond these initial grants created tensions that escalated into open warfare by the 460 SAD. Archaeological evidence for this transition appears in the form of destruction layers at Romano-British sites, changes in settlement patterns, and the appearance of Germanic material culture in areas previously occupied exclusively by Romano-British populations. Excavations at Wroxeter reveal a destruction layer dating to approximately 460 AD, followed by the construction of Germanic-style timber buildings within the former Roman town. Similar patterns appear at Silchester, where Germanic pottery and metalwork appear in contexts post-dating the abandonment of Roman civic buildings and the establishment of new settlement areas organised according to Germanic spatial principles. The cemetery evidence provides crucial insights into the demographic and social processes accompanying territorial expansion. Early Germanic cemeteries in Kent, such as those at Fingalsham and Sayre, contain burial assemblages that demonstrate continuity with continental traditions, while incorporating elements that reflect interaction with Romano-British populations. Male graves contain characteristic Germanic weapon sets including spears, shields and seaxes, but also Romano-British belt fittings and brooches that suggest either intermarriage or the adoption of local status symbols. Female burials show similar patterns of cultural mixing, with continental Germanic brooches and beads appearing alongside Romano-British jewellery types and domestic implements. The archaeological evidence reveals significant regional variation in the process of Germanic settlement and territorial control. In Kent, The presence of exceptionally rich burial assemblages containing Frankish imports and Mediterranean luxury goods suggests that Germanic leaders maintained diplomatic and commercial connections with continental European networks while establishing their authority over Romano-British populations. The Taplow burial, dating to the late 5th century AD, contained gold bracteates, garnet-inlaid jewellery, and imported glass vessels that demonstrate access to luxury goods networks extending across northern Europe. East Anglian settlement patterns reveal different dynamics of territorial acquisition and population interaction. Archaeological evidence from sites like Spong Hill and Caister by Norwich shows large-scale Germanic immigration involving entire communities rather than just military elites. The cemetery assemblages contain grave goods representing all social levels, from warrior elites buried with complete weapon sets to farmers interred with agricultural tools and domestic implements. The presence of women's graves containing continental Germanic dress accessories and domestic equipment indicates family-based migration that aimed at permanent territorial occupation rather than temporary military service. The establishment of Germanic settlements in the region that would become Mercia followed yet another pattern of territorial acquisition. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Trent Valley shows Germanic communities settling in areas that had experienced Romano-British population decline during the early 5th century AD. The absence of destruction layers and the gradual replacement of Romano-British material culture with Germanic types suggests peaceful occupation of territories that had been abandoned or only sparsely populated by the time of Germanic arrival. Northumbrian settlement patterns reveal the most complex interaction between Germanic immigrants and indigenous populations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Yevering shows the establishment of Germanic royal centres that incorporated Romano-British architectural traditions and administrative practices. The Great Hall complex at Yevering combined Germanic timber construction techniques with Roman-influenced planning principles, creating a unique architectural synthesis that reflected both cultural continuity and political adaptation to local conditions. The military tactics employed by Germanic warbands during their territorial expansion reflected both continental traditions and adaptation to British conditions. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and battlefield sites reveals the continued importance of infantry combat formations, centred on spear-armed warriors supported by shield walls. However, the incorporation of Romano-British cavalry equipment and the adaptation of Roman military engineering techniques for siege warfare demonstrate tactical flexibility that enhance Germanic military effectiveness against both Romano-British defenders and competing Germanic groups. The Nidham and Thorsberg weapon deposits provide detailed evidence for Germanic military equipment during the conquest period. Spearheads from these sites show standardized production techniques that enabled mass production of effective infantry weapons, while the presence of specialized weapon types, including angons and franciscas, indicates tactical diversity within Germanic military systems. The systematic destruction of captured weapons in these votive deposits reflects religious practices that attributed military success to divine favour and ensured continued supernatural support for future campaigns. Shield construction techniques revealed through archaeological analysis demonstrate sophisticated understanding of defensive equipment requirements. Germanic shields typically featured limewood boards covered with leather and reinforced with iron bosses and rim bindings. The standardized dimensions and construction techniques evident in archaeological examples suggest organized production systems that could equip large numbers of warriors with effective defensive equipment. The decorative elements on shield bosses and rim fittings reveal regional variations that may reflect tribal identities or unit affiliations within larger military organizations. The gradual shift from raiding to permanent settlement involved fundamental changes in Germanic community organization and territorial control strategies. early raiding activities focused on portable wealth acquisition and the disruption of Romano-British economic systems, evidenced through the distribution of hoarded Roman coins and precious metal objects that date to the mid-5th century AD. However, the establishment of permanent settlements required different organisational approaches that emphasised agricultural production, craft specialisation, and the integration of indigenous populations into Germanic social structures. Archaeological evidence from Germanic settlement sites reveals the development of mixed agricultural systems that combined continental Germanic farming practices with Romano-British techniques adapted to local environmental conditions. The presence of Romano-British agricultural tools in Germanic contexts suggests either the incorporation of indigenous farmers into Germanic communities or the adoption of superior local technologies by Germanic settlers. Pollen analysis from settlement sites shows the continuation of Roman field systems, alongside the establishment of new agricultural areas organised according to Germanic principles. The establishment of craft production centres within Germanic settlements demonstrates the development of economic systems capable of supporting permanent territorial occupation. Archaeological excavations at sites like Weststow have revealed specialised workshops for metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacturing that supplied both local needs and regional exchange networks. The technical analysis of products from these workshops shows the gradual integration of Romano-British and Germanic technological traditions, creating hybrid production systems that maximise the advantages of both cultural backgrounds. The interaction between Germanic settlers and Romano-British populations produced complex patterns of cultural integration and demographic displacement that varied significantly across different regions and social levels. Archaeological evidence suggests that Romano-British elites experienced the most dramatic changes in status and territorial control, with many villa sites showing abandonment or conversion to Germanic settlement use during the later 5th century AD. However, the continued presence of Romano-British pottery types and domestic practices in Germanic contexts indicates the survival and integration of substantial indigenous populations at lower social levels. Cemetery evidence reveals the most detailed information about population interaction and cultural integration processes. Mixed cemeteries containing both Germanic and Romano-British burial practices appear throughout eastern England, with grave assemblages that demonstrate cultural exchange and intermarriage between immigrant and indigenous communities. The gradual adoption of Germanic burial customs by Romano-British populations and the incorporation of Romano-British elements into Germanic funerary practices suggest ongoing cultural negotiation rather than simple demographic replacement. The linguistic evidence for population interaction emerges through place name analysis that reveals the survival of Romano-British territorial divisions and settlement names alongside the establishment of new Germanic place names. The preservation of Roman road names and river designations indicates continued use of existing transportation and communication networks, while the appearance of Germanic settlement names reflects new community foundations and territorial organisation. The hybrid place names that combine Germanic and Romano-British elements suggest areas where cultural integration proceeded through negotiation rather than conquest. The archaeological record reveals that Germanic territorial expansion in Britain involved multiple simultaneous processes including military conquest, negotiated settlement, peaceful immigration, and gradual cultural assimilation that varied according to local circumstances and the relative strength of competing populations. The success of Germanic settlement ultimately depended on their ability to adapt continental traditions to British conditions while maintaining sufficient cultural cohesion to preserve tribal identity and political organisation. The material culture evidence demonstrates that this adaptation process created new synthetic traditions that would form the foundation for Anglo-Saxon civilization in early medieval England. the successful territorial expansion across Britain that had transformed scattered Germanic warbands into established communities created the foundation for more sophisticated political structures that would define Anglo-Saxon civilization for the next 4 centuries. The archaeological evidence from royal centres, administrative complexes, and elite burial sites reveals the gradual development of centralised authority systems that combined continental Germanic traditions with Romano-British administrative practices and indigenous British political concepts. These emerging kingdoms represented far more than simple tribal territories. They constituted complex political entities capable of coordinating military campaigns, managing agricultural production, administering justice, and conducting diplomatic relations across significant geographical areas. The Wuffingas dynasty emerged as the dominant political force in East Anglia through a combination of military success, strategic marriage alliances, and the careful cultivation of religious authority that legitimised their territorial claims. Archaeological excavations at Sutton Hoo have revealed the extraordinary wealth and international connections of this royal house, with Mound 1 containing burial goods that demonstrate access to luxury items from across Europe and beyond. The Great Gold Belt buckle, weighing 414 grams, displays intricate interlaced animal designs executed with technical precision that required specialised craftsmen working with sophisticated tools and extensive artistic training. The purse lid contained 37 Merovingian gold coins, alongside blank gold ingots and jewellery fragments, indicating both participation in continental European monetary systems and the accumulation of bullion reserves that supported royal economic activities. The helmet recovered from the Sutton Hoo burial represents the pinnacle of early medieval metalworking artistry, constructed from iron plates covered with bronze sheets decorated with silver wire inlay and garnet cloisonné work. The face mask features eyebrows and moustache formed by bronze strips inlaid with silver wire, while the nose and mouth guards display geometric patterns that required hundreds of hours of specialised labour to complete. The helmet crest depicts a bronze dragon with garnet eyes positioned above a boar figure, symbolic elements that connected the wearer to both Germanic warrior traditions and the supernatural authority necessary for effective kingship. The Wuffingas genealogies preserved in later medieval sources trace the dynasty's origins to continental Anglian nobility, specifically connecting the royal house to the legendary figure of Wuffa, and through him to the god Woden himself. Archaeological evidence supports these genealogical claims through the discovery of material culture that demonstrates continuity with continental Germanic traditions, while incorporating elements that reflect adaptation to British conditions. The presence of continental Germanic weapon types in East Anglian royal burials alongside Romano-British luxury goods indicates the maintenance of cultural connections with ancestral homelands, while establishing authority over indigenous British populations. The territorial extent of Wuffingas authority encompassed the fertile agricultural regions of Norfolk and Suffolk, with archaeological evidence indicating control over strategic river systems that provided both transportation routes and defensive boundaries. Excavations at sites like Rendlesham have revealed royal administrative centres that combined residential complexes with specialised workshops, storage facilities, and ceremonial areas. The presence of imported pottery, metalwork, and glass at these sites demonstrates the concentration of wealth and resources necessary to support royal households and the administrative apparatus required for territorial governance. The development of royal administrative systems within East Anglia reveals sophisticated approaches to territorial management that incorporated both Germanic and Romano-British organisational principles. Archaeological evidence from royal centres shows the establishment of specialised craft workshops that produce standardised goods for distribution throughout the kingdom. Metalworking areas at sites like Brandon have yielded evidence for the mass production of agricultural tools, weapons, and domestic implements using techniques that combined continental Germanic traditions with Romano-British manufacturing methods. The standardization of product types and decorative schemes suggests centralized control over craft production that served both economic and political functions within the emerging kingdom. The Eklingis dynasty that established Mercian royal authority followed different patterns of territorial acquisition and political organization that reflected the geographical and demographic conditions of the English Midlands. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Trent Valley reveals the gradual consolidation of smaller territorial units into a larger political confederation that eventually dominated central England. The Royal Centre at Tamworth shows evidence of continuous occupation from the late 5th century AD, with successive building phases that demonstrate increasing architectural sophistication and territorial control capabilities. The material culture from early Mercian royal sites reveals a distinctive blend of Germanic, Romano-British, and indigenous British elements that created unique artistic and technological traditions. Excavations at Repton have uncovered a royal mausoleum complex that served as the burial place for Mercian kings from the 7th through 9th centuries AD. The architectural remains include stone-built structures that incorporated Romano-British construction techniques with Germanic spatial organisation principles, creating monumental buildings that expressed royal authority through both scale and artistic sophistication. Mercian expansion into the English Midlands during the 6th century AD involved the systematic conquest and integration of smaller territorial units that had maintained independence during the initial Germanic settlement period. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites throughout the region shows destruction layers dating to this period, followed by the construction of new settlement complexes organised according to Mercian administrative principles. The presence of Mercian pottery types and metalwork styles in formerly independent territories indicates not merely military conquest, but cultural transformation that integrated conquered populations into Mercian political and economic systems. The development of Mercian royal authority involved the creation of administrative hierarchies that extended royal control throughout the expanding kingdom. Archaeological evidence from secondary centres like Lichfield and Worcester reveals the establishment of regional administrative complexes that combined royal residences with religious foundations and craft production facilities. These sites served as focal points for royal authority within specific territorial divisions, enabling centralized control over large geographical areas through a network of subordinate officials and religious authorities. The formation of Northumbria through the union of Bernicia and Deira represented the most complex political development among the emerging Anglian kingdoms, involving the integration of two distinct territorial entities with different settlement histories and demographic compositions. Bernicia, centred on the coastal fortress of Bamborough, had developed through the conquest of British territories in what had been the northern frontier zone of Roman Britain. Archaeological evidence from sites like Yeavering reveals the adaptation of existing British royal centres to Germanic political needs, with timber hall complexes constructed according to continental Germanic architectural principles, while incorporating Romano-British site planning concepts. Deiran political development followed different patterns that reflected the region's location in the fertile river valleys of Yorkshire, where Germanic settlement had proceeded through more gradual processes of territorial acquisition and population integration. Archaeological evidence from sites like Goodmanham shows the establishment of Germanic royal centres that incorporated existing British religious sites, suggesting political strategies that emphasised continuity with indigenous traditions rather than complete cultural replacement. The presence of both Germanic and British material culture in royal contexts indicates successful integration of diverse populations under unified political authority. The union of Bernicia and Deira under Aethelfrith in the early 7th century AD created a powerful kingdom that dominated northern England and southern Scotland through military conquest and diplomatic alliance. Archaeological evidence from royal centres throughout Northumbria shows increased standardisation of material culture and administrative practices that reflected centralised royal control over the unified kingdom. The construction of monumental royal halls at sites like Yeavering and Millfield demonstrates the resources and organisational capabilities available to Northumbrian kings for expressing their authority through architectural display. Northumbrian military expansion under royal leadership involved sophisticated strategies that combined traditional Germanic warfare techniques with adaptation to the geographical and political conditions of northern Britain. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites and fortified positions reveals the use of coordinated infantry formations supported by cavalry units that could exploit the mobility advantages provided by the region's river valleys and coastal plains. The construction of defensive earthworks and fortified settlements throughout Northumbrian territory indicates systematic approaches to territorial control that combined military occupation with administrative organisation. The development of royal administrative systems throughout the Anglian kingdoms involved the creation of legal frameworks that combined Germanic customary law with Romano-British legal traditions and indigenous British practices. Archaeological evidence for these legal systems appears primarily through the analysis of settlement organisation, burial practices and material culture distributions that reflect social hierarchies and legal relationships. The standardisation of weights and measures found at royal centres indicates the development of administrative systems capable of managing complex economic relationships and territorial governance. The concept of Bretwalda, or overlordship, emerged from the competitive relationships between the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as successful rulers extended their authority beyond their original territorial boundaries. Archaeological evidence for these overlordship relationships appears through the distribution of luxury goods, architectural styles, and administrative practices that reflect political subordination and cultural influence between kingdoms. The presence of East Anglian metalwork styles in Mercian contexts and Northumbrian pottery types in southern English sites suggests political relationships that involved both military dominance and cultural exchange. The material expressions of Bretwalda authority included the construction of monumental royal centres that demonstrated the resources and organisational capabilities of overlords to subordinate kingdoms. The Great Hall complex at Yeavering, measuring over 25 metres in length, could accommodate hundreds of individuals for royal assemblies and ceremonial gatherings that reinforced political relationships through ritualised displays of authority and subordination. The architectural sophistication of these structures, incorporating advanced timber construction techniques and decorative elements, served both practical and symbolic functions in maintaining overlordship relationships. The administrative mechanisms that supported Bretwalda authority involved the coordination of military resources, the collection of tribute payments, and the management of diplomatic relationships between multiple kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from royal centres shows the presence of specialised storage facilities and administrative buildings that could handle the complex logistical requirements of overlordship. The discovery of standardised weights and measures at multiple royal sites indicates the development of administrative systems capable of managing tribute collection and resource distribution across large geographical areas. The development of royal law codes during the 6th and 7th centuries AD reflected the need for standardised legal frameworks that could govern increasingly complex social relationships within and between the emerging kingdoms. While the earliest written law codes date to the late 7th century AD, archaeological evidence suggests the existence of sophisticated legal systems that regulated property ownership, social relationships, and criminal justice within Anglo-Saxon communities. The standardisation of burial practices and settlement organisation patterns indicates the presence of legal frameworks that defined social hierarchies and territorial relationships according to consistent principles. The archaeological evidence for early Anglo-Saxon legal systems appears through the analysis of cemetery organisation, settlement spatial arrangements, and material culture distributions that reflect legal relationships and social obligations. The positioning of graves within cemetery spaces, the types and quantities of grave goods deposited with different individuals, and the spatial relationships between burial areas and settlement complexes all provide insights into legal concepts that governed Anglo-Saxon society. The presence of execution cemeteries and the evidence for judicial punishment in skeletal remains demonstrates the enforcement mechanisms that supported royal legal authority. The integration of Romano-British legal traditions into Anglo-Saxon administrative systems created hybrid legal frameworks that combined Germanic customary practices with Roman legal concepts adapted to post-imperial conditions. Archaeological evidence for this integration appears through the continued use of Roman territorial boundaries, the adoption of Romano-British administrative practices, and the incorporation of Roman legal symbols and ceremonial elements into Anglo-Saxon royal regalia. The presence of Roman-style seals and administrative implements in Anglo-Saxon royal contexts indicates the conscious adoption of imperial administrative traditions to legitimize royal authority. The development of royal administrative capabilities involved the creation of specialized roles and institutional structures that could manage the complex requirements of territorial governance. Archaeological evidence from royal centres reveals the presence of specialised buildings and activity areas that served administrative functions, including record-keeping facilities, storage areas for tribute collection, and workshop complexes for the production of royal regalia and ceremonial objects. The standardisation of architectural forms and spatial organisation at multiple royal sites indicates the development of institutional frameworks that could be replicated across different territorial contexts. The emergence of ecclesiastical administration alongside royal governance created parallel institutional structures that supported territorial control through religious authority and cultural influence. Archaeological excavations at early monastery sites like Whitby and Jarrow reveal the establishment of religious centres that combined spiritual functions with administrative capabilities, serving as focal points for royal authority within specific territorial divisions. The presence of specialised scriptoriums, libraries and administrative buildings at these sites demonstrates the integration of religious and secular administrative functions under royal patronage. The sophisticated administrative and political structures that had enabled Anglian kingdoms to establish territorial control across much of England faced their most profound transformation with the arrival of Augustine's mission at Canterbury in 597 AD. Pope Gregory the Great's carefully planned evangelical campaign represented far more than a simple religious conversion effort. It constituted a systematic attempt to integrate Anglo-Saxon England into the broader framework of European Christian civilization through the establishment of ecclesiastical hierarchies that would parallel and ultimately supersede existing royal administrative systems. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury reveals the immediate establishment of a substantial missionary complex that included residential quarters, workshops, and ceremonial spaces designed to support long-term evangelical activities throughout southeastern England. The material culture associated with Augustine's mission demonstrates the resources and organisational capabilities that Rome committed to the English conversion project. Excavations at St. Augustine's Abbey have uncovered imported Mediterranean pottery, glass vessels and metalwork that indicate direct supply lines from continental European Christian centres. The presence of specialised liturgical equipment, including bronze censers, silver chalices and illuminated manuscripts, reveals the establishment of fully equipped religious centres capable of conducting sophisticated Christian ceremonies that would impress Anglo-Saxon audiences accustomed to elaborate pagan rituals. The architectural remains show stone construction techniques imported from continental European monastic traditions, creating permanent religious centres that contrasted dramatically with the timber buildings characteristic of Anglo-Saxon royal complexes. The initial resistance encountered by Augustine's mission reflected deep-seated cultural and political concerns within Anglian kingdoms rather than simple religious conservatism. Archaeological evidence from pagan religious sites throughout East Anglia and Mercia shows continued ritual activity well into the 7th century AD, indicating persistent adherence to traditional Germanic religious practices despite Christian missionary activities. The temple complex at Goodmanham in Northumbria reveals evidence of elaborate pagan ceremonies continuing alongside early Christian activities, suggesting a prolonged period of religious competition and coexistence rather than immediate conversion. The political implications of Christian conversion created significant challenges for Anglian royal dynasties, whose authority rested partially on their claimed descent from Germanic gods and their role as intermediaries between human communities and divine powers. Archaeological evidence from royal burial sites shows the gradual transformation of funerary practices as Christian beliefs influenced traditional Germanic concepts of death and afterlife. The Prittlewell burial in Essex, dating to the early 7th century AD, contains both Christian symbols and traditional Germanic grave goods, indicating the complex negotiation between religious traditions that characterise the conversion period. Ethelbert of Kent's conversion around 601 AD established the first major precedent for royal acceptance of Christian authority, but archaeological evidence suggests that his decision reflected careful political calculation rather than sudden religious revelation. The continued presence of Germanic religious symbols in Kentish royal regalia and the persistence of traditional burial practices among the Kentish nobility indicate that conversion initially involved diplomatic accommodation rather than fundamental religious transformation. Excavations at royal centres throughout Kent reveal the gradual introduction of Christian architectural elements and liturgical objects, alongside the maintenance of traditional Germanic ceremonial spaces and ritual equipment. The resistance of northern Anglian kingdoms to Roman Christianity created opportunities for alternative Christian traditions to establish influence throughout Northumbria and adjacent territories. Celtic Christianity, transmitted through Irish and Scottish missionary activities, had developed distinctive theological emphases and organisational structures that differed significantly from Roman ecclesiastical traditions. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites in Northumbria reveals material culture that reflects Celtic rather than Roman Christian influences, including distinctive metalwork styles, manuscript illumination techniques, and architectural approaches that originated in Irish and Scottish monastic centres. The establishment of Lindisfarne as a major religious centre under Irish influence in 635 AD created a powerful alternative to Roman Christian authority that would dominate Northumbrian religious life for several decades. Archaeological excavations on Holy Island have revealed the remains of a substantial monastic complex that included residential buildings, workshops, scriptoriums, and ceremonial spaces organised according to Celtic monastic principles. The material culture from Lindisfarne shows direct connections with Irish monastic centres, including pottery types, metalwork styles, and manuscript production techniques that originated in Ireland and spread throughout Celtic Christian territories. The distinctive artistic traditions that developed at Lindisfarne combined Celtic decorative motifs with Germanic artistic elements and classical influences transmitted through Christian iconographic traditions. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced around 715 AD, demonstrate the sophisticated synthesis of cultural traditions that characterised Northumbrian Christianity during this period. The manuscript's carpet pages feature interlaced animal designs that derive from Germanic metalwork traditions, combined with Celtic spiral motifs and Mediterranean Christian iconographic elements. The technical execution required specialised pigments imported from across Europe, including lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and gold leaf that indicates access to international trade networks. Aidan's missionary activities throughout Northumbria established a network of religious centres that serve both spiritual and administrative functions within the expanding Christian infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from sites like Melrose and Old Melrose reveals the establishment of monastic communities that combined religious observance with practical activities including agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and educational services. These centres served as focal points for Christian influence within their surrounding territories, providing models of Christian living that gradually influenced local populations through example rather than coercion. The educational activities conducted at Celtic Christian centres created literate communities capable of preserving and transmitting both religious and secular knowledge. Archaeological evidence from monastic scriptoriums reveals sophisticated book production facilities that created manuscripts for distribution throughout northern England and beyond. The presence of writing materials, copying equipment, and library facilities at sites like Jarrow and Wearmouth demonstrates the establishment of educational infrastructure that would prove crucial for the development of Anglo-Saxon intellectual culture. The theological differences between Roman and Celtic Christianity created ongoing tensions that extended beyond purely religious concerns to encompass questions of political authority and cultural identity. The Celtic calculation of Easter dates, their distinctive tonsure practices, and their approaches to episcopal organisation represented challenges to Roman ecclesiastical authority that had broader implications for the integration of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into European Christian civilization. Archaeological evidence from religious sites throughout England reveals the coexistence of Roman and Celtic Christian practices during the 7th century AD, indicating a period of religious competition and negotiation that would ultimately require formal resolution. The political dimensions of the Roman-Celtic Christian conflict involved fundamental questions about the relationship between secular and religious authority within Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Roman Christianity emphasized hierarchical organization and centralized authority that aligned with imperial administrative traditions, while Celtic Christianity maintained more decentralized organizational structures that reflected Irish and Scottish political traditions. Archaeological evidence from royal centres shows the gradual adoption of Roman Christian ceremonial elements alongside the maintenance of traditional Germanic royal symbols, indicating the complex negotiation between different concepts of legitimate authority. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD represented the culmination of decades of theological and political tension between Roman and Celtic Christian traditions within Northumbria. King Osric's decision to support Roman Christian practices reflected careful consideration of both religious and political factors that would determine Northumbria's relationship with continental European Christian civilization. Archaeological evidence from Whitby Abbey reveals the establishment of a major religious centre that would serve as a focal point for Roman Christian influence throughout northern England, with architectural remains that demonstrate direct connections to continental European monastic traditions. The material culture from Whitby Abbey shows the immediate establishment of Roman Christian practices following the Synod's decision. Excavations have revealed liturgical equipment, architectural elements, and manuscript production facilities that conform to Roman rather than Celtic Christian traditions. The presence of Mediterranean imports and continental European artistic influences indicates the rapid integration of Whitby into Roman Christian networks that extended across Western Europe. The Abbey's role in training religious personnel and producing manuscripts ensured the spread of Roman Christian practices throughout territories under Northumbrian influence. The resolution achieved at Whitby had immediate consequences for religious practices throughout Anglo-Saxon England, but archaeological evidence suggests that the transition from Celtic to Roman Christianity proceeded gradually through local adaptation rather than immediate replacement. Religious sites throughout Northumbria show evidence of continued Celtic Christian influences well into the 8th century AD, indicating that the Synod's decisions required ongoing implementation efforts to achieve complete conformity with Roman practices. The persistence of Celtic artistic elements in manuscript illumination and metalwork demonstrates the lasting cultural impact of Irish and Scottish Christian traditions, despite official adoption of Roman ecclesiastical authority. The transformation of Anglian society through Christian influence extended far beyond formal religious conversion to encompass fundamental changes in social organisation, economic practices, and cultural values. Archaeological evidence from Christian cemetery sites reveals the gradual abandonment of traditional Germanic burial practices in favour of Christian interment customs that emphasise spiritual equality rather than social hierarchy. The disappearance of grave goods from Christian burials represented a significant change in attitudes toward death and afterlife that had broader implications for social relationships and economic practices within Anglo-Saxon communities. The establishment of monastic centres throughout Anglian territories created new forms of economic organisation that combined religious observance with practical production activities. Archaeological excavations at sites like Jarrow reveal sophisticated agricultural systems that supported large monastic communities while producing surplus resources for distribution to surrounding populations. The presence of specialised workshops, mills, and storage facilities at monastic sites indicates the development of economic infrastructure that served both religious and secular needs within their territories. Monasticism introduced new concepts of social organisation that challenged traditional Germanic hierarchies while creating alternative pathways for social advancement and cultural influence. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals communities that included individuals from diverse social backgrounds, united through religious commitment rather than kinship or political allegiance. The presence of high-quality personal possessions and specialised equipment in monastic contexts indicates that religious communities attracted individuals with substantial resources and skills who contributed to the economic and cultural development of their institutions. The educational functions performed by monastic centres created literate communities that preserved and transmitted both Christian and classical knowledge throughout Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological evidence from monastic libraries and scriptoriums reveals the establishment of educational infrastructure that supported advanced learning in theology, classical literature, natural philosophy, and practical subjects. The production of manuscripts for distribution throughout England and continental Europe indicates the development of intellectual networks that connected Anglo-Saxon monasteries with the broader framework of European Christian scholarship. Jarrow's establishment as a major centre for Christian learning under Benedict Biscop created one of the most significant intellectual centres in early medieval Europe. Archaeological excavations have revealed the remains of a substantial monastic complex that included residential quarters, workshops, scriptoriums, and library facilities designed to support advanced scholarly activities. The presence of imported books, writing materials, and artistic supplies indicates direct connections with continental European intellectual centres that provided resources for scholarly work. The monastery's role in producing the Codex Amiatinus, one of the most significant biblical manuscripts of the early medieval period, demonstrates the sophisticated scholarly capabilities that developed within Anglo-Saxon monastic communities. The architectural innovations introduced through Christian building projects transformed the physical landscape of Anglo-Saxon England through the construction of stone churches, monasteries, and associated buildings that represented new approaches to monumental construction. Archaeological evidence from early Christian sites reveals the gradual adoption of continental European building techniques that created permanent religious centres capable of serving large communities over extended periods. The use of imported stone, specialised construction tools, and advanced engineering techniques indicates the transfer of technological knowledge from continental European Christian centres to Anglo-Saxon communities. the artistic traditions that developed within Christian contexts combined Germanic decorative motifs with Mediterranean Christian iconographic elements and Celtic artistic influences to create distinctive Anglo-Saxon Christian art forms. Archaeological evidence from manuscript illumination, metalwork and stone carving reveals the development of synthetic artistic traditions that express Christian themes through artistic vocabularies derived from multiple cultural sources. The technical sophistication of these artistic productions required specialized training and access to imported materials that indicate the establishment of advanced craft production systems within Christian communities. The integration of Christian and secular authority systems created new forms of political organization that combined traditional Germanic concepts of kingship with Christian theories of divinely sanctioned royal authority. Archaeological evidence from royal centres shows the gradual incorporation of Christian ceremonial elements into traditional Germanic royal rituals, creating hybrid forms of political expression that legitimized royal authority through both ancestral and divine sanction. The construction of royal chapels and the adoption of Christian royal regalia indicate the systematic integration of Christian symbols into Anglo-Saxon political culture. The systematic integration of Christian symbols into Anglo-Saxon political culture that had begun during the conversion period reached its fullest expression during the 7th and 8th centuries AD, when Anglian kingdoms achieved unprecedented levels of cultural sophistication that would establish them as major centres of European learning and artistic achievement. The monastic scriptoriums established at centres like Jarrow, Wearmouth, and Lindisfarne became focal points for intellectual activity that combined Christian scholarship with classical learning and Germanic cultural traditions, creating a unique synthesis that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. Archaeological excavations at these sites reveal the physical infrastructure that supported this cultural flowering: specialized buildings designed for manuscript production, libraries capable of housing hundreds of volumes, and workshops equipped with the tools and materials necessary for advanced artistic and scholarly work. The Venerable Bede's composition of the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum at Jarrow between 725 and 731 AD represents the pinnacle of early medieval historical scholarship and demonstrates the sophisticated intellectual capabilities that had developed within Anglian monastic communities. Bede's access to extensive documentary sources, including papal correspondence, royal charters, and earlier historical works, indicates the establishment of comprehensive archival systems within major monasteries that preserved materials essential for scholarly research. The manuscript evidence reveals that Jarrow's library contained works by classical authors, including Pliny, Virgil, and Ovid, alongside Christian theological texts and contemporary historical materials, creating a scholarly environment that combined Christian learning with classical intellectual traditions. The technical aspects of manuscript production at Jarrow demonstrate the sophisticated organisational systems that supported advanced scholarly work. Archaeological evidence from the monastery's scriptorium reveals specialised workstations equipped with writing desks, ink preparation areas, and parchment processing facilities that could support multiple scribes working simultaneously on complex projects. The discovery of imported pigments including ultramarine, vermilion and gold leaf indicates access to international trade networks that supplied materials necessary for high-quality manuscript illumination. The presence of specialized tools for parchment preparation, including curved knives, pumice stones and ruling instruments, demonstrates the technical expertise required for professional manuscript production. Bede's scholarly methodology combined rigorous source criticism with systematic organisational principles that established new standards for historical writing in medieval Europe. His careful citation of documentary sources, his systematic chronological framework based on Anno Domini dating, and his critical evaluation of conflicting accounts demonstrate intellectual approaches that reflected both classical historical traditions and contemporary scholarly developments. The survival of Bede's working notes and draft materials in later manuscript collections provides insights into his research methods, revealing systematic approaches to source collection, fact verification, and narrative construction that required extensive library resources and collaborative scholarly networks. The educational system that produced scholars like Bede involved comprehensive curricula that combined Christian theological instruction with classical liberal arts education and practical skills necessary for monastic administration. Archaeological evidence from monastic schools reveals educational facilities that included classrooms, libraries, and workshops where students learned grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, astronomy, and music alongside theological subjects. The presence of educational materials, including wax tablets, styluses, and elementary textbooks, indicates systematic approaches to instruction that could accommodate students at various levels of advancement. Caedmon's revolutionary integration of Christian themes with traditional Germanic poetic forms created new literary possibilities that would influence English poetry for centuries. The account of Caedmon's divine inspiration preserved in Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica describes the transformation of an illiterate herdsman into a skilled poet, capable of rendering biblical narratives in alliterative verse forms familiar to Anglo-Saxon audiences. Archaeological evidence from Whitby Abbey, where Caedmon lived and worked, reveals a substantial monastic community that included both learned clerics and lay people engaged in various forms of religious and cultural activity. The technical aspects of Anglo-Saxon poetic composition required mastery of complex metrical systems that combined strict structural requirements with sophisticated literary techniques. Alliterative verse demanded precise control of stress patterns, consonantal alliteration, and semantic relationships between verse halves that created both musical effects and meaningful connections between ideas. The preservation of Caedmon's hymns in multiple manuscript traditions indicates their widespread circulation and influence throughout Anglo-Saxon England, suggesting that his innovations established new standards for Christian poetry that were rapidly adopted by other poets. The cultural significance of Caedmon's work extended beyond purely literary considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between Germanic cultural traditions and Christian religious expression. His adaptation of traditional heroic poetry techniques to Christian subject matter created precedents for the cultural synthesis that would characterize Anglo-Saxon Christian literature. Archaeological evidence from monastic libraries reveals the preservation of both Christian and secular poetic works, indicating institutional support for literary traditions that maintained connections with pre-Christian cultural heritage while expressing Christian theological themes. The manuscript traditions that preserved early Anglo-Saxon poetry reveal sophisticated systems for collecting, copying and transmitting literary works throughout England and continental Europe. The survival of poetic texts in multiple manuscript versions indicates active scribal networks that ensured the preservation of important literary works despite the fragility of individual manuscripts. The presence of musical notation in some poetic manuscripts suggests that these works were performed with melodic accompaniment, adding another dimension to their cultural significance within monastic and secular contexts. The artistic achievements of Anglian scriptoriums reached their highest expression in illuminated manuscripts that combined Germanic decorative traditions with Celtic artistic influences and Mediterranean Christian iconographic elements. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced around 715 AD, demonstrates the technical sophistication and artistic vision that characterised Northumbrian manuscript illumination during this period. The manuscript's 259 folios contain over 2,100 decorated initials, alongside full-page carpet pages and evangelist portraits that display extraordinary artistic complexity and technical precision. The carpet pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels feature geometric patterns of unprecedented complexity that required mathematical precision and artistic skill to execute successfully. The interlaced designs incorporate over 10,000 individual decorative elements arranged in symmetrical patterns that create optical effects through the interplay of positive and negative space. The technical analysis of these decorations reveals the use of compass-drawn guidelines and mathematical proportions that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of geometric principles applied to artistic composition. The integration of zoomorphic elements, including birds, serpents, and quadrupeds, within the geometric frameworks creates narrative dimensions that transform abstract patterns into symbolic representations of Christian theological concepts. The pigments used in the Lindisfarne Gospels indicate access to materials from across the known world, including lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, Kermes red from Mediterranean regions, and gold leaf that required specialized preparation techniques. The technical analysis of paint application reveals sophisticated understanding of pigment properties and binding agents that ensured the long-term stability of the decorative elements. The layering of different pigments to create subtle colour variations and the use of reserved areas to create highlighting effects demonstrate artistic techniques that required extensive training and practical experience. The calligraphic elements of the Lindisfarne Gospels represent the highest achievement of insular script development, combining legibility with decorative sophistication that transform textual presentation into artistic expression. The manuscript contains multiple script types, including uncial, half-uncial, and cursive forms that were employed according to hierarchical principles that emphasized important textual elements through visual prominence. The consistency of letter forms throughout the manuscript indicates the work of a master scribe capable of maintaining high standards across extensive textual material. The artistic influences evident in Northumbrian manuscript illumination reflect the cosmopolitan cultural environment that characterized major Anglian monastic centres during the 7th and 8th centuries AD. Germanic interlaced animal designs appear alongside Celtic spiral motifs, Mediterranean Christian iconographic elements, and Eastern decorative patterns that indicate exposure to artistic traditions from across Europe and beyond. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals the presence of imported artistic objects including ivory carvings, metalwork, and textiles that provided models for local artistic production. The metalworking traditions that flourished in Anglian kingdoms during this period combined advanced technical skills with sophisticated artistic vision to create objects that served both practical and ceremonial functions. The Sutton Hoo helmet demonstrates the pinnacle of early medieval metalworking achievement, incorporating multiple manufacturing techniques including repousse work, cloison decoration, and precision casting that required specialized tools and extensive technical knowledge. The helmet's construction involved over 500 individual components, assembled through techniques that combined functional requirements with decorative sophistication. The garnet cloison work that decorates numerous objects from Sutton Hoo represents one of the most technically demanding decorative techniques employed by early medieval craftsmen. The creation of cloison decoration required precise cutting of garnets to fit individual cells, the construction of gold wire frameworks to hold the stones, and the application of backing materials that enhance the optical properties of the garnets. The technical analysis of Sutton Hoo cloisonner work reveals the use of specialized tools, including fine-pointed gravers, precision measuring instruments, and heating equipment that enabled craftsmen to work with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The gold belt buckle from Sutton Hoo Mound, one weighs 414.62 grams and displays interlaced animal designs executed with extraordinary technical precision and artistic sophistication. The buckle's construction required advanced casting techniques that could reproduce fine decorative details while maintaining structural integrity under practical use. The surface decoration features over 40 individual animal figures arranged in complex interlaced patterns that required careful planning and execution to achieve visual coherence. The technical analysis reveals the use of multiple casting operations and extensive hand-finishing work that transformed the basic cast form into a masterpiece of decorative art. The purslid from the same burial demonstrates different metalworking techniques applied to create equally sophisticated decorative effects. The object's framework consists of gold sheet worked in repousse technique to create raised decorative elements, while the surface decoration incorporates cloison garnets, millefiori glass, and filigree work that required mastery of multiple specialized techniques. The integration of these different decorative approaches within a single object demonstrates the comprehensive technical skills available to Anglo-Saxon craftsmen during this period. The distribution of high-quality metalwork throughout Anglian territories indicates the existence of specialized workshop systems that could produce luxury goods for elite consumption while maintaining consistent technical and artistic standards. Archaeological excavations at sites like Brandon and Rendlesham have revealed metalworking areas that contained specialized tools, raw materials, and production debris associated with luxury metalwork production. The presence of imported materials including garnets from India and Sri Lanka, gold from various European sources, and silver from continental European mines indicates access to international trade networks that supplied materials necessary for high-status craft production. The educational achievements of Anglian scholars extended far beyond their immediate monastic communities to influence intellectual development throughout Europe during the 8th and 9th centuries AD. Alcuin of York's appointment as master of Charlemagne's palace school at Aachen in 782 AD represents the international recognition of Anglo-Saxon scholarly achievements and their contribution to the broader European intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Alcuin's educational background at York Minster provided him with comprehensive training in classical and Christian learning that enabled him to establish educational programs that would influence European scholarship for generations. The library at York Minster, where Alcuin received his education and later served as master, contained one of the most comprehensive collections of books in 8th century Europe. Contemporary sources describe a library that included works by classical authors, Christian theological texts, historical works, and scientific treatises that provided resources for advanced scholarly research. Archaeological evidence from the Minster complex reveals substantial buildings that could house extensive book collections alongside facilities for manuscript production and educational activities. The presence of imported books and writing materials indicates active connections with continental European intellectual centres that facilitated scholarly exchange and collaboration. Alcuin's curriculum at Charlemagne's Palace School combined classical liberal arts education with Christian theological instruction and practical administrative training that prepared students for leadership roles in both ecclesiastical and secular contexts. His educational writings, including textbooks on grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, established pedagogical approaches that influenced European education for centuries. The systematic organisation of knowledge that characterises Alcuin's educational programme reflects intellectual traditions that had developed within Anglo-Saxon monastic schools through the integration of classical learning with Christian scholarship. The scholarly networks that connected Anglo-Saxon intellectuals with continental European centres facilitated the exchange of ideas, manuscripts and personnel that contributed to the broader intellectual revival of the 8th and 9th centuries AD. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals the presence of foreign scholars and the circulation of manuscripts between England and continental Europe that supported collaborative scholarly projects. The survival of extensive correspondence between Anglo-Saxon and continental scholars provides insights into the intellectual relationships that sustained these scholarly networks. The archaeological evidence from Sutton Hoo provides unprecedented insights into the wealth and sophistication of Anglo-Saxon royal culture during the early 7th century AD. The burial assemblage from Mound 1 contains over 260 individual objects that demonstrate access to luxury goods from across Europe and beyond. The presence of Byzantine silver bowls, Coptic bronze bowls, and Merovingian gold coins indicates participation in international trade networks that connected Anglo-Saxon England with the broader European and Mediterranean world. The technical sophistication of locally produced objects equals or exceeds that of imported luxury goods, demonstrating the advanced craft production capabilities available within Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The ship burial tradition represented at Sutton Hoo reflects Scandinavian cultural influences that persisted within Anglo-Saxon royal ceremonial practices despite Christian conversion. The vessel used for the burial measured approximately 27 metres in length and represents one of the largest ships known from early medieval Europe. The ship's construction techniques, revealed through careful archaeological analysis of the surviving impression and metal fittings, demonstrate advanced shipbuilding capabilities that enabled long-distance sea travel and military operations. The symbolic significance of ship burial within Germanic royal traditions connected earthly kingship with divine authority through associations with mythological journeys to otherworldly realms. The grave goods assemblage from Sutton Hoo Mound 1 includes weapons, regalia, and domestic objects that provide insights into Anglo-Saxon concepts of royal authority and the material requirements of kingship. The sword recovered from the burial features a pattern-welded blade with gold and garnet hilt fittings that represent the pinnacle of early medieval weapon production. The shield contains decorative elements, including dragon and bird figures executed in cloison technique, while the spears display silver inlays and decorative fittings that transform functional weapons into ceremonial objects suitable for royal use. The Prittlewell burial in Essex, dating to the early 7th century AD, provides additional evidence for the material culture of Anglo-Saxon royal elites during the conversion period. The burial chamber contained over 40 gold objects, alongside imported luxury goods, including Byzantine and Frankish metalwork, that demonstrate continued participation in international exchange networks. The presence of both Christian and pagan symbolic elements within the burial assemblage indicates the complex religious environment that characterized Anglo-Saxon society during the transition to Christianity. The technical sophistication of locally produced objects matches that found at Sutton Hoo, suggesting widespread availability of advanced craft production capabilities within Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The sophisticated craft production capabilities and international connections that had enabled Anglian kingdoms to achieve unprecedented cultural heights during the 7th century created the material foundations for increasingly ambitious territorial expansion and political consolidation during the following century. The wealth accumulated through trade networks, tribute collection, and agricultural surplus provided Anglian rulers with the resources necessary to maintain larger military forces, construct more elaborate administrative centres, and compete effectively with neighbouring kingdoms for regional dominance. Archaeological evidence from royal centres throughout the Midlands reveals dramatic increases in the scale and sophistication of defensive works, ceremonial buildings, and craft production facilities that supported the emerging Mercian hegemony over central England. Penda's rise to power in Mercia during the 620 SAD marked the beginning of systematic Anglian expansion that would transform the political geography of Anglo-Saxon England for the next 2 centuries. Archaeological excavations at Tamworth reveal substantial construction projects dating to this period, including defensive earthworks that enclosed an area of approximately 30 hectares and timber hall complexes that could accommodate hundreds of warriors and retainers. The material culture from these early phases shows increased standardization of weapons, pottery, and metalwork that indicates centralized production systems capable of equipping large military forces with uniform equipment. The presence of imported luxury goods including Frankish glassware, Byzantine silver, and Rhine Valley pottery demonstrates continued access to continental European trade networks that provided both prestige objects and strategic materials. The military innovations that enabled Mercian expansion combined traditional Germanic infantry tactics with new organisational approaches that maximise the effectiveness of larger military forces. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and battlefield sites reveals the systematic adoption of standardised spear types, shield designs, and protective equipment that enhanced unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. The Staffordshire Hoard, discovered near Lichfield and dating to the 7th century, contains over 3,500 individual items, including sword pommels, helmet fragments, and decorative fittings that demonstrate the scale of military equipment production required to support Mercian military activities. The technical analysis of these objects reveals advanced manufacturing techniques, including pattern welding, cloison decoration, and precision casting that required specialised workshops and extensive raw material supplies. Penda's military campaigns against Northumbria, Wessex and East Anglia during the 630s and 640s AD established Mercian dominance over much of central and southern England through a combination of direct conquest and tributary relationships. Archaeological evidence from royal centres throughout these regions shows destruction layers dating to this period, followed by the construction of new administrative complexes that reflect Mercian organisational principles. The distribution of Mercian pottery types and metalwork styles throughout formerly independent territories indicates not merely political control, but systematic cultural influence that integrated conquered populations into Mercian administrative and economic systems. The Battle of Maserfield in 642 AD, where Penda's forces killed King Oswald of Northumbria, demonstrated Mercian military capabilities and established Penda as the dominant power in Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological investigations in the region identified as the probable battle site have revealed weapon fragments, horse equipment, and personal ornaments that provide insights into the scale and intensity of this engagement. The discovery of high-status metalwork, including gold and garnet jewellery, suggests the participation of royal retinues and elite warriors, whose deaths would have had significant political consequences for the defeated kingdom. The systematic destruction of Northumbrian royal regalia and ceremonial objects found in contemporary weapon deposits reflects ritual practices that transferred the supernatural authority of defeated rulers to victorious war leaders. The administrative systems that Penda developed to govern his expanding territories combined traditional Germanic tribal organisation with innovations that reflected the challenges of managing geographically dispersed populations and resources. Archaeological evidence from secondary centres throughout Mercia reveals the establishment of regional administrative complexes that combined royal residences with specialised craft workshops, storage facilities and religious centres. These sites served as focal points for royal authority within specific territorial divisions, enabling centralised control over large geographical areas through networks of subordinate officials and allied local rulers. The economic foundations of Mercian expansion involved systematic exploitation of natural resources, including iron ore deposits, salt production areas, and fertile agricultural regions that provided both raw materials and surplus production for trade activities. Archaeological excavations at sites like Droitwich reveal large-scale salt production facilities that operated under royal control, producing a valuable commodity for both local consumption and long-distance trade. The standardization of production techniques and container types indicates centralized management systems that coordinated resource extraction with distribution networks extending throughout Mercian territories and beyond. Offa's accession to the Mercian throne around 757 AD marked the beginning of the most ambitious phase of Anglian territorial consolidation, characterised by systematic administrative reforms and massive construction projects that demonstrated unprecedented royal authority and organisational capabilities. Archaeological evidence from Tamworth shows extensive rebuilding during the early years of Offa's reign, including the construction of stone buildings that incorporated continental European architectural techniques alongside traditional Germanic spatial organisation principles. The presence of imported building materials, including Rhenish lava quern stones, continental European roof tiles, and specialised metalwork indicates direct connections with Frankish territories that provided both technical knowledge and luxury materials. The monetary reforms implemented under Offa's authority established the first systematic coinage system in Anglo-Saxon England, creating standardised silver pennies that facilitated trade activities and demonstrated royal control over precious metal supplies. Archaeological evidence from mints at Canterbury, London, and other major centres reveals sophisticated coin production facilities that could manufacture thousands of coins using standardised dies and consistent silver alloy compositions. The distribution of Offa's coins throughout England and continental Europe indicates the widespread acceptance of Mercian currency and the integration of English economic systems with broader European commercial networks. The technical sophistication of Offan coinage demonstrates advanced metalworking capabilities that required specialised knowledge of silver refining, die cutting, and precision striking techniques. The coins display consistent weight standards, artistic quality, and metallurgical composition that match contemporary Frankish and Byzantine issues, indicating participation in international monetary systems that facilitated long-distance trade and diplomatic relationships. The presence of Offa's coins in Scandinavian hoards and continental European archaeological contexts demonstrates the international recognition of Mercian political authority and economic stability. The artistic elements incorporated into Offan coinage reveal sophisticated understanding of royal iconography and symbolic communication that connected Mercian kingship with broader European concepts of legitimate authority. The coin designs feature royal portraits, religious symbols, and decorative elements that demonstrate direct influence from Byzantine and Frankish numismatic traditions, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that identified specifically Mercian royal authority. The technical execution of these designs required specialised engraving skills and artistic knowledge that indicates the presence of trained craftsmen familiar with continental European artistic traditions. The construction of Offa's dyke between approximately 784 and 796 AD represents the most ambitious engineering project undertaken in early medieval Britain, creating a linear earthwork that extended over 240 kilometres from the Severn estuary to the Irish Sea coast. Archaeological investigations along the dyke's length reveal construction techniques that combine traditional Germanic earthwork methods with engineering innovations that maximise defensive effectiveness while minimising labour requirements. The dyke consists of an earth bank averaging 7.5 metres in height with an accompanying ditch on the western side, creating a formidable barrier that controlled movement between Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms. The scale of labour required for the dyke's construction indicates organisational capabilities that could coordinate the activities of thousands of workers across multiple construction seasons. Archaeological evidence suggests that different sections were built by work gangs, drawn from specific territorial divisions within Mercia, with variations in construction techniques and earthwork profiles that reflect local building traditions and available materials. The presence of temporary camps and tool deposits along the construction route provides insights into the logistical systems that supplied workers with food, equipment, and raw materials during the building process. The strategic positioning of Offa's dyke reflects sophisticated understanding of Welsh territorial boundaries and defensive requirements that maximised Mercian control over cross-border movement while minimising construction costs. The earthwork follows ridgelines and river valleys that provided natural defensive advantages while avoiding areas of difficult terrain that would have required excessive labour investment. Archaeological surveys reveal that the dike incorporated existing defensive works and settlement boundaries, indicating systematic planning that integrated new construction with established territorial markers. The defensive effectiveness of Offa's dike depended on coordinated garrison systems that could respond rapidly to attempted border crossings and maintain regular patrol activities along the earthwork's length. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites adjacent to the dike reveals the establishment of military installations that housed permanent garrisons and provided bases for mounted patrols. These sites contain weapon caches, horse equipment, and specialized military equipment that indicates professional military forces rather than local militia units. The relationship between Offa's dike and contemporary Welsh kingdoms reveals complex patterns of diplomacy and conflict that extended beyond simple territorial demarcation to encompass trade regulation, tribute collection, and population control. Archaeological evidence from border regions shows continued cultural exchange and economic interaction despite the physical barrier created by the earthwork. The presence of Mercian pottery and metalwork in Welsh contexts alongside Welsh products in Mercian sites indicates ongoing commercial relationships that operated within frameworks established through diplomatic negotiations. The internal conflicts that characterised relationships between Anglian kingdoms during the 8th century reflected increasing competition for limited resources and territorial expansion opportunities as population growth and economic development created pressure for continued expansion. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites and fortified settlements reveals escalating military activities that required larger military forces, more sophisticated defensive works, and increased investment in weapons production and military logistics. The appearance of professional military equipment including mail armour, specialised weapons, and horse gear in archaeological contexts indicates the development of warrior elites whose primary occupation involved military service, rather than agricultural production. The emergence of Wessex as a rival power to Mercian hegemony during the later 8th century created new patterns of political alliance and military competition that would ultimately transform the political geography of Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological evidence from West Saxon royal centres shows dramatic increases in the scale and sophistication of defensive works, ceremonial buildings, and craft production facilities that supported growing military and administrative capabilities. The material culture from these sites reveals increasing standardization of weapons, pottery, and metalwork that indicates centralized production systems capable of equipping large military forces with uniform equipment. The Battle of Ellendun in 825 AD, where Egbert of Wessex defeated Beornwulf of Mercia, marked the beginning of West Saxon dominance over southern England and the decline of Mercian political authority. Archaeological investigations in the battle area have revealed weapon fragments, horse equipment, and personal ornaments that provide insights into the scale and intensity of this engagement. The discovery of high-status metalwork, including decorated sword fittings and royal regalia, suggests the participation of both kingdoms' elite military forces in a conflict that determined political supremacy for the following century. The administrative innovations developed within Anglian kingdoms during this period created sophisticated governmental systems that combined traditional Germanic tribal organisation with Roman administrative concepts and Christian ecclesiastical structures. Archaeological evidence from royal centres reveals the establishment of specialised buildings and activity areas that served administrative functions, including record-keeping facilities, law courts, and treasury buildings that managed the complex requirements of territorial governance. The standardization of weights and measures found at multiple royal sites indicates the development of administrative systems capable of managing tribute collection, trade regulation, and resource distribution across large geographical areas. The development of written law codes during the 8th century AD reflected the need for standardized legal frameworks that could govern increasingly complex social relationships within and between the expanding kingdoms. Archaeological evidence for legal administration appears through the analysis of settlement organization, specialized buildings, and material culture distributions that reflect legal relationships and administrative procedures. The presence of writing materials, seals, and document storage facilities at royal centres indicates the establishment of bureaucratic systems capable of maintaining legal records and administrative correspondence. The trade networks that developed during this period connected Anglian kingdoms with commercial systems extending throughout northern Europe and the Mediterranean world. Archaeological evidence from emporia like Hamwick and Ipswich reveals large-scale commercial activities that involved the import and export of raw materials, manufactured goods, and luxury items that supported both elite consumption and craft production systems. The presence of foreign pottery, metalwork, and glass at these sites indicates regular commercial contact with Frankish territories, Scandinavian regions, and more distant areas, including the Byzantine Empire and Islamic world. The craft production systems that supported these trade networks involved specialized workshops that could manufacture goods for both local consumption and export markets. Archaeological excavations at production centres reveal sophisticated manufacturing techniques, standardized product types, and quality control systems that enabled Anglian craftsmen to compete effectively in international markets. The technical analysis of exported goods found in continental European contexts demonstrates the high quality and distinctive characteristics of Anglian products that established market recognition and commercial success. The trade networks and craft production systems that had enabled Anglian kingdoms to compete effectively in international markets during the 8th century faced their most severe disruption on June 8, 793 AD, when Viking longships appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne carrying warriors whose maritime capabilities and tactical innovations would transform the political and cultural landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The attack on the monastery represented far more than a simple raid for portable wealth. It marked the beginning of systematic Scandinavian expansion that would challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying Anglian territorial organisation, religious authority, and economic systems that had developed over 3 centuries of gradual consolidation. Archaeological excavations on Holy Island have revealed the physical evidence of this devastating assault through destruction layers that contain fragments of illuminated manuscripts, melted metalwork, and human skeletal remains showing evidence of violent death. The monastery's stone buildings, which had been constructed using continental European techniques and represented significant investment in permanent religious infrastructure, show clear signs of deliberate destruction, including fire damage, structural collapse, and the systematic removal of valuable architectural elements, including carved stone crosses and decorative metalwork. The discovery of scattered manuscript fragments in contexts associated with the destruction layer indicates the deliberate targeting of the monastery's library and scriptorium, suggesting that the attackers understood the cultural and economic value of the religious centre's intellectual resources. The material culture recovered from the destruction contexts reveals the sophisticated organisation of the Viking assault force and their systematic approach to wealth extraction. Iron tools, including axes, hammers, and prying implements found within the monastery buildings, indicate the use of specialised equipment for breaking into stone structures and extracting valuable objects embedded in architectural contexts. The presence of ship rivets and nautical equipment in the destruction layer suggests that the attackers brought their vessels close to shore and may have used them for transporting looted materials back to their ships during the raid. The human skeletal remains discovered in contexts associated with the attack provide grim evidence of the violence that accompanied the monastery's destruction. Analysis of the bones reveals weapon injuries consistent with sword cuts, axe blows, and spear wounds that indicate close-quarters combat between the monastic community and their attackers. The positioning of some remains suggests attempts to flee or hide within the monastery buildings, while others show evidence of deliberate execution or ritual killing that may have reflected Scandinavian religious practices or psychological warfare tactics designed to terrorize surviving populations. The immediate impact of the Lindisfarne raid extended far beyond the physical destruction of a single monastery to encompass fundamental challenges to the religious and political authority systems that had sustained Anglian civilization. Contemporary chronicles describe the attack as unprecedented in its sacrilege and violence, indicating that established concepts of sanctuary and religious immunity had provided no protection against the Scandinavian assault. The targeting of ecclesiastical centres represented a direct challenge to the Christian worldview that had become central to Anglo-Saxon political legitimacy and cultural identity during the previous 2 centuries. The psychological impact of the raid reverberated throughout Northumbria and adjacent kingdoms as news of the monastery's destruction spread through established communication networks. Archaeological evidence from other religious centres shows immediate defensive preparations, including the construction of earthwork fortifications around previously undefended monasteries, the burial of valuable objects in concealed locations, and the establishment of watch systems designed to provide early warning of approaching raiders. The Jarrow Monastery, located only a few miles from Lindisfarne, shows evidence of hasty defensive construction dating to the immediate aftermath of the 793 attack, including ditches and palisades that transformed the peaceful religious centre into a fortified compound. The economic consequences of the Lindisfarne raid disrupted established patterns of religious patronage and craft production that had supported monastic communities throughout Northumbria. Archaeological evidence from religious centres shows decreased construction activity, reduced importation of luxury materials, and the abandonment of specialised craft workshops that had produced manuscripts, metalwork, and other religious objects. The monastery's role as a centre for international scholarly exchange came to an abrupt end as the destruction of its library and scriptorium eliminated resources that had attracted students and scholars from throughout Europe. The Viking assault techniques revealed at Lindisfarne established patterns that would characterise Scandinavian raids throughout the following decades. The attackers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Anglian defensive weaknesses, particularly the vulnerability of isolated religious centres that contained concentrated wealth but lacked adequate military protection. Archaeological evidence suggests that the raiders possessed detailed intelligence about the monastery's layout, the location of valuable objects, and the timing of religious activities that would maximise their tactical advantages while minimising resistance. The longships that enabled the Lindisfarne raid represented technological innovations that gave Scandinavian warriors significant advantages over existing Anglian naval capabilities. Archaeological analysis of ship remains from contemporary Scandinavian contexts reveals vessels designed specifically for rapid coastal raiding, with shallow drafts that enabled navigation in rivers and estuaries, flexible construction that could withstand beach landings, and carrying capacities that supported substantial warrior crews along with their equipment and supplies. The ship's speed and manoeuvrability allowed raiders to appear suddenly at vulnerable targets and withdraw before organised resistance could be mounted. The weapons and equipment employed by the Lindisfarne raiders reflected Scandinavian military traditions that emphasised individual warrior prowess within coordinated tactical formations. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and grave assemblages reveals the systematic use of iron axes designed for both combat and demolition work, spears with specialised heads optimised for thrusting attacks, and swords featuring pattern-welded blades that combined functional effectiveness with symbolic significance. The presence of specialized siege equipment, including grappling hooks, rope, and wooden ladders, indicates sophisticated preparation for assaulting fortified positions. The Great Heathen Army's arrival in East Anglia during 865 AD marked the transition from opportunistic raiding to systematic territorial conquest, as Scandinavian forces demonstrated capabilities for sustained military campaigns involving thousands of warriors operating across multiple kingdoms simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from the army's winter camps reveals the organisational sophistication required to maintain large military forces in hostile territory, including defensive earthworks that could protect substantial numbers of men and horses, storage facilities for supplies and plunder, and workshop areas for maintaining weapons and equipment during extended campaigns. The establishment of the army's base at Thetford in East Anglia provided strategic advantages that enabled subsequent operations throughout eastern England. Archaeological excavations in the area have revealed extensive earthwork fortifications that enclosed an area of approximately 25 hectares, sufficient to accommodate several thousand warriors along with their horses, equipment, and support personnel. The defensive works incorporated existing topographical features including river courses and elevated ground that maximised defensive advantages while providing access to transportation routes necessary for supply and communication activities. The material culture from great heathen army camps reveals the diverse origins of the warriors who participated in this massive military enterprise. Pottery, metalwork, and personal ornaments found in camp contexts reflect manufacturing traditions from throughout Scandinavia, indicating that the army drew recruits from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, rather than representing a single tribal or regional group. The presence of Frankish and Frisian objects suggests that some warriors had participated in earlier continental campaigns, or maintained connections with established trade networks that supplied equipment and luxury goods. The logistical systems that supported the Great Heathen Army's operations required unprecedented coordination of supply activities, transportation networks, and communication systems that enabled sustained military campaigns across vast geographical areas. Archaeological evidence reveals the establishment of supply depots at strategic locations throughout eastern England, including fortified sites that could protect accumulated provisions and equipment while serving as bases for local operations. The presence of specialised storage buildings, grain processing facilities, and livestock pens indicates systematic approaches to provisioning that could support large numbers of warriors over extended periods. The conquest of York in 866 AD demonstrated the army's capability for capturing and holding major urban centres through coordinated assault tactics that overcame sophisticated defensive systems. Archaeological evidence from Coppergate and other areas of Viking Age York reveals the systematic transformation of the former Northumbrian royal centre into a Scandinavian administrative and commercial hub. The material culture from the earliest Viking levels shows immediate changes in pottery types, metalworking techniques, and domestic practices that reflect the arrival of substantial Scandinavian populations rather than merely military occupation forces. The urban planning changes implemented in Viking York reveal Scandinavian approaches to territorial organisation that differed significantly from earlier Anglian administrative systems. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence for the establishment of new street layouts, the construction of specialised craft workshops, and the development of commercial areas that served both local populations and long-distance trade networks. The presence of weights, scales, and foreign coins in early Viking contexts indicates the immediate establishment of commercial systems that connected York with Scandinavian trade networks extending throughout northern Europe. The establishment of the Danelaw through treaties negotiated between Alfred of Wessex and Guthrum around 886 AD created formal territorial boundaries that recognised Scandinavian political control over much of eastern England. while establishing frameworks for coexistence between Anglo-Saxon and Viking populations. Archaeological evidence from the boundary regions reveals the complex processes of territorial division and administrative organisation that accompanied this political settlement. The presence of mixed material culture assemblages in border areas indicates ongoing interaction between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian communities despite formal political separation. The administrative systems established within the Danelaw combined Scandinavian legal traditions with existing Anglo-Saxon territorial organisation to create hybrid governmental structures that could manage culturally diverse populations. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavian administrative centres reveals the adoption of existing royal sites and religious centres for new governmental functions, indicating pragmatic approaches to territorial control that utilised established infrastructure while implementing Scandinavian organisational principles. The continued use of existing road networks, market centres, and agricultural systems suggests systematic efforts to maintain economic productivity while establishing new political authority. Anglian responses to Viking expansion involve fundamental changes in military organisation, defensive strategies, and territorial administration that transformed traditional approaches to warfare and political control. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites throughout Mercia and Wessex reveals massive construction projects designed to create coordinated defensive systems capable of resisting Scandinavian assault tactics. The Burr system developed under Alfred and his successors created a network of fortified settlements that could provide refuge for rural populations while serving as bases for military operations against Viking forces. The construction techniques employed in Burr fortifications demonstrate sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and military engineering that incorporated both traditional Germanic earthwork methods and innovations adapted from continental European fortification systems. Archaeological excavations at sites like Wallingford and Cricklade reveal standardised construction approaches that created defensive works capable of withstanding siege warfare while accommodating substantial civilian populations during emergencies. The earthwork ramparts typically measured 6 metres in height with accompanying ditches that created formidable obstacles for attacking forces, while internal layouts provided space for residential areas, craft workshops, and storage facilities. The military reforms that accompanied defensive construction projects involved fundamental changes in Anglo-Saxon approaches to warfare that reflected adaptation to Scandinavian tactical innovations and organisational systems. Archaeological evidence reveals increased emphasis on cavalry forces equipped with specialised weapons and protective equipment that could respond rapidly to Viking raids and pursue retreating enemy forces. The presence of horse gear, riding equipment, and cavalry weapons in military contexts indicates systematic development of mounted warfare capabilities that had been less important in earlier Anglo-Saxon military traditions. The weapons production systems that supported Anglo-Saxon resistance efforts involved massive increases in the scale and sophistication of metalworking activities throughout territories threatened by Viking expansion. Archaeological excavations at production centres reveal specialised workshops capable of manufacturing standardised weapons, armour, and military equipment in quantities sufficient to equip large military forces. The technical analysis of weapons from this period shows improvements in metallurgical techniques, standardisation of design elements, and quality control systems that enhanced combat effectiveness while reducing production costs. The cultural impact of Scandinavian settlement created complex patterns of interaction, adaptation, and synthesis that transformed both Anglo-Saxon and Viking communities throughout eastern England. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals the gradual integration of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon material culture traditions, creating hybrid forms that combined elements from both cultural backgrounds. Pottery assemblages from mixed communities show the adoption of Scandinavian vessel forms and decorative techniques alongside the continuation of Anglo-Saxon, manufacturing traditions, indicating ongoing cultural exchange and adaptation. The linguistic evidence for Scandinavian cultural influence appears through place name analysis that reveals extensive adoption of Old Norse toponymic elements throughout areas of Viking settlement. The presence of place names ending in by, thorp, toft, and other Scandinavian elements indicates not merely military conquest but substantial population settlement that established permanent Scandinavian communities throughout the Danelaw. The distribution patterns of these place names provide insights into settlement density, territorial organisation, and the relationship between Scandinavian immigrants and existing Anglo-Saxon populations. The material culture evidence for cultural integration reveals complex processes of selective adoption and adaptation that created new synthetic traditions combining Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian elements. Archaeological assemblages from mixed communities show the continued production of traditional Anglo-Saxon object types alongside the introduction of distinctively Scandinavian forms, indicating cultural negotiation rather than simple replacement. The appearance of hybrid decorative styles, manufacturing techniques, and domestic practices demonstrates ongoing interaction and intermarriage between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian populations that created new cultural forms adapted to local conditions and preferences. The complex processes of selective adoption and adaptation that had created new synthetic traditions, combining Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian elements throughout the Danelaw, faced their ultimate transformation during the systematic reconquest campaigns launched by Edward the Elder, beginning in 909 AD. The West Saxon king's military operations against Viking-held territories represented far more than simple territorial recovery. They constituted a comprehensive program of political integration that would absorb the distinctive Anglian kingdoms into a unified English state, while preserving many of their cultural and administrative traditions. Archaeological evidence from newly conquered territories reveals the careful balance Edward maintained between asserting royal authority and accommodating local practices that had developed during 2 centuries of independent Anglian rule. Edward's initial campaigns focused on securing strategic fortifications that could serve as bases for further operations, while demonstrating West Saxon military capabilities to both Viking defenders and Anglo-Saxon populations seeking liberation from Scandinavian control. The Siege of Bedford in 915 AD established patterns of systematic fortress reduction that would characterise the entire reconquest campaign. Archaeological excavations within the former Danish stronghold reveal evidence of intense fighting, including arrowheads embedded in timber palisades, fire damage to defensive structures, and hasty repairs to fortifications that indicate prolonged resistance before the final assault. The discovery of West Saxon military equipment, including standardised spearheads and shield fittings and contexts associated with the siege, demonstrates the professional quality of Edward's forces and their systematic approach to fortress warfare. The administrative systems Edward established in conquered territories combined West Saxon governmental principles with existing Anglian and Danish administrative structures to create hybrid forms of territorial control that could accommodate diverse populations and established customs. Archaeological evidence from royal centres established during the Reconquest reveals the construction of new administrative complexes that incorporated elements from both West Saxon and Anglian architectural traditions. The Royal Hall at Stamford, constructed shortly after the town's capture in 918 AD, features timber construction techniques characteristic of West Saxon building traditions while maintaining spatial organisation principles derived from earlier Anglian royal architecture. The integration of former Danelaw territories required sophisticated approaches to legal administration that could reconcile West Saxon law codes with established Scandinavian legal traditions and surviving Anglian customary practices. Archaeological evidence for these legal negotiations appears through the analysis of settlement patterns, property boundaries, and material culture distributions that reflect changing legal relationships and administrative procedures. The continued use of existing field systems and property divisions in conquered territories indicates Edward's pragmatic recognition of established land tenure arrangements, while the appearance of West Saxon administrative artefacts suggests the gradual implementation of unified legal standards. Athelstan's accession in 924 AD marked the acceleration of integration processes as the new king pursued more ambitious programs of cultural and political unification throughout his expanded territories. His systematic approach to territorial administration involved the establishment of standardized governmental procedures, legal frameworks, and economic systems that created genuine unity rather than mere political control over conquered populations. Archaeological evidence from royal centres throughout the former Anglian kingdoms reveals extensive construction projects that created uniform administrative infrastructure while incorporating local architectural traditions and spatial organisation principles that maintained connections with regional cultural identities. The law codes promulgated under Athelstan's authority demonstrate sophisticated understanding of the legal complexities created by territorial integration and the need for frameworks that could accommodate diverse legal traditions while establishing consistent standards of justice throughout the unified kingdom. Archaeological evidence for legal administration appears through specialised court buildings, document storage facilities, and administrative complexes that could manage the complex requirements of unified territorial governance. The presence of standardized weights and measures at administrative centres throughout former Anglian territories indicates successful implementation of unified economic standards that facilitated trade and taxation across regional boundaries. Athelstan's military campaigns in Scotland and Wales established English authority over territories that had remained independent during earlier phases of Anglo-Saxon expansion, creating a unified kingdom that encompassed virtually all of Britain south of the Fourth Clyde Line. The Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD represented the culmination of these territorial ambitions as Athelstan's forces defeated a coalition of Scottish, Irish, and Norse armies that had challenged English dominance. Archaeological investigations in areas identified as possible battle sites have revealed weapon fragments, personal ornaments, and horse equipment that provide insights into the scale and international significance of this engagement that secured English control over northern Britain. The transformation of distinct Anglian identity into broader Anglo-Saxon and eventually English cultural synthesis involved complex processes of cultural negotiation that preserved important elements of regional tradition while creating new unified cultural forms that could serve as foundations for English national identity. Archaeological evidence from religious centres, craft production sites, and settlement complexes reveals the gradual emergence of cultural patterns that combined elements from multiple regional traditions into synthetic forms that transcended earlier tribal and territorial boundaries while maintaining connections with ancestral cultural practices. The preservation of Anglian legal traditions within the unified English legal system demonstrates the sophisticated approaches to cultural integration that characterised the formation of the English kingdom. The survival of distinctively Anglian legal concepts, including specific approaches to property inheritance, criminal justice procedures, and administrative organisation, indicates systematic efforts to maintain valuable legal traditions while adapting them to unified governmental frameworks. Archaeological evidence for legal continuity appears through the continued use of existing court sites, administrative centres, and territorial boundaries that preserved established legal relationships while integrating them into broader English administrative systems. Dialectal variations that had distinguished different Anglian regions from each other and from West Saxon territories persisted throughout the integration period and contributed to the linguistic diversity that would characterise Middle English development. The survival of distinctively Anglian vocabulary items, grammatical constructions, and phonological features in areas of former Anglian settlement indicates the maintenance of regional linguistic identity despite political integration. Place name evidence reveals the continued use of Anglian toponymic elements alongside the introduction of West Saxon administrative terminology, creating linguistic landscapes that reflected both political unity and cultural diversity. Regional customs associated with agricultural practices, craft production techniques, and social organisation survived the political integration process and contributed to the cultural diversity that enriched unified English civilization. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the continuation of distinctively Anglian farming methods, field systems, and livestock management practices that had developed in response to specific environmental conditions and cultural preferences. The persistence of specialised craft production traditions, including pottery manufacturing, metalworking, and textile production, demonstrates the economic value of regional expertise and the pragmatic recognition of established production systems by unified English administrators. The architectural traditions that had developed within different Anglian kingdoms contributed distinctive elements to the emerging English architectural synthesis that combined regional building techniques with unified stylistic principles. Archaeological evidence from religious and secular buildings constructed during the integration period reveals the creative combination of West Saxon, Mercian, Northumbrian, and East Anglian architectural elements into new synthetic forms that expressed unified English identity while maintaining connections with regional traditions. The great churches constructed during this period demonstrate sophisticated understanding of architectural symbolism that could express both political unity and cultural diversity through the integration of multiple regional traditions. The literary traditions that had flourished within Anglian kingdoms provided crucial foundations for the development of unified English literary culture that would reach its fullest expression during the later Anglo-Saxon period. The preservation of Anglian poetic forms, narrative traditions, and linguistic elements in manuscripts produced throughout unified England indicates systematic efforts to maintain valuable cultural traditions while adapting them to new political and religious contexts. The continued copying and circulation of texts that had originated within different Anglian kingdoms demonstrates the recognition of their cultural value and their contribution to emerging English literary traditions. The educational systems that had developed within Anglian monastic centres continue to influence English intellectual development throughout the integration period and beyond, providing models for scholarly activity and institutional organisation that supported the cultural achievements of unified English civilization. Archaeological evidence from monastic libraries and scriptoriums reveals the continued production and circulation of manuscripts that preserved both classical and vernacular learning traditions that had originated within different Anglian kingdoms. The survival of distinctive educational approaches and scholarly methodologies indicates the lasting influence of Anglian intellectual traditions on English cultural development. The economic systems that had supported Anglian kingdoms provided important foundations for the commercial networks and production systems that sustained unified English prosperity during the 10th and 11th centuries. Archaeological evidence from craft production centres, market towns and trading settlements reveals the continuation of established economic activities alongside the development of new commercial opportunities created by political unification. The standardisation of currency systems, weights and measures, and commercial regulations created unified economic frameworks while preserving regional specialisations and production traditions that contributed to economic diversity and stability. The religious institutions that have been established within Anglian kingdoms played crucial roles in the cultural and administrative integration of unified England, providing institutional frameworks that could bridge regional differences while maintaining connections with local traditions and identities. Archaeological evidence from cathedral complexes monastic centres, and parish churches reveals the systematic development of unified ecclesiastical administration that incorporated existing religious institutions while establishing consistent organisational principles throughout the English kingdom. The continued use of existing religious sites and the preservation of local saints' cults demonstrates the pragmatic approach to religious integration that characterised English unification. The military traditions that had developed within different Anglian kingdoms contributed important elements to the unified English military system that would defend the kingdom against subsequent external threats, including renewed Viking invasions and Norman conquest attempts. Archaeological evidence from fortifications, weapon production centres, and military equipment reveals the integration of regional military traditions into unified defensive systems that combine the best elements from different Anglian military cultures. The preservation of regional military specializations and the adaptation of local defensive strategies to unified command structures demonstrate the sophisticated military organization that supported English territorial integrity. The assessment of Anglian contributions to English language development reveals the fundamental importance of Anglian dialects in shaping the linguistic characteristics that would distinguish English from other Germanic languages and contribute to its eventual emergence as a global language. The Anglian substrate in Middle English vocabulary, grammar and phonology provided essential foundations for linguistic developments that would continue throughout the medieval period and beyond. The survival of distinctively Anglian linguistic features in regional dialects and their influence on Standard English development demonstrates the lasting significance of Anglian cultural contributions to English national identity. The legal traditions that had originated within Anglian kingdoms provided crucial precedents for English common law development and contributed distinctive approaches to justice administration that would influence legal development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The preservation of Anglian legal concepts, including specific approaches to property rights, criminal procedure, and administrative organisation, demonstrates the lasting influence of Anglian political culture on English governmental development. Archaeological evidence for legal continuity reveals the systematic preservation of valuable legal traditions while adapting them to unified governmental frameworks that could serve the needs of an increasingly complex political entity. The literary legacy of Anglian kingdoms extends far beyond the preservation of specific texts to encompass fundamental contributions to English literary development, including poetic forms, narrative structures, and thematic concerns that would continue to influence English literature throughout the medieval period and into the modern era. The alliterative verse traditions that had developed within Anglian courts provided essential foundations for the great literary achievements of later Anglo-Saxon England, including works like Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The survival of Anglian literary techniques and their adaptation to new cultural contexts demonstrates the lasting significance of Anglian cultural achievements for English literary development. The cultural identity that emerged from the integration of Anglian kingdoms into unified England represents one of the most successful examples of cultural synthesis in medieval European history, creating a unified national identity that preserved valuable regional traditions while establishing frameworks for continued cultural development and adaptation. The balance achieved between political unity and cultural diversity provided models for successful integration that would influence subsequent developments in English political and cultural organisation. The lasting influence of Anglian cultural contributions on English national identity demonstrates the fundamental importance of these early medieval kingdoms in shaping the civilization that would eventually spread throughout the world. The transformation of the Angles from a continental Germanic tribe into founding contributors to English civilization represents one of the most remarkable cultural journeys in European history. From their origins in the coastal marshlands of Schleswig-Holstein, through their migration across the North Sea, their establishment of powerful kingdoms in post-Roman Britain, and their ultimate integration into a unified English state, the Anglian peoples demonstrated remarkable adaptability while maintaining core cultural values that would profoundly influence the development of English civilization. Their contributions to English language, law, literature, and cultural identity created lasting legacies that continued to shape English development long after the distinctive Anglian kingdoms had been absorbed into the unified English state, establishing foundations that would support England's eventual emergence as a major European power and global influence.